At a place called Abu Hurera, on a low rise above the Euphrates River in what is now northern Syria, archaeologists working in the 1970s lifted the bones of women who had lived more than 11,000 years ago, and they noticed something that did not appear in the male skeletons buried beside them. The women's knees were worn smooth on the inside, polished by years of pressure against stone. Their lower spines were compressed in a pattern that did not appear in the men of the same village. Their toe joints had collapsed forward, the small bones of the feet bent into a permanent crouch. The bones of their forearms carried ridges of muscle attachment that were thicker, denser, and more pronounced than anything found on the men buried only a few meters away. The lead osteologist on that project, Thea Mollison of the Natural History Museum in London, examined those remains for nearly 2 decades before she finally said in plain language what they meant. These women had spent their lives kneeling on stone, leaning forward at the hips, grinding grain between 2 heavy slabs of rock for hours every day, so that everyone else in the settlement could eat. The grinding wore their bodies into a shape. That shape is still inside the female skeleton today. You carry a version of it. Your mother carried it, your grandmother carried it. The great-grandmother whose photograph you may have on a wall somewhere, in a black dress and a tight collar, carried it under that dress without ever knowing it had a name. This is one finding. There are hundreds more like it, from every inhabited continent on Earth, spanning roughly 100,000 years of human history. They tell a single story, and that story is the subject of this video. The female body, across roughly 4,000 human generations, was shaped by a survival pressure that the male body was not asked to carry in the same way, for the same hours, with the same daily repetition. The pressure was feeding others first, the food prepared by her hands, the grain ground by her arms, the roots dug from frozen soil by her fingers, the shellfish pried from cold tidal rocks by her thumbs. The infants nursed at her chest while she worked. The elders fed before she sat down to eat what was left. The hunters fed when they returned at dusk, regardless of when she herself had last eaten. The orphan cousin fed. The sick neighbour fed. The traveller who arrived after dark fed. And then, when everyone else had eaten, the woman who had ground and chopped and stirred and served sat down at last to whatever remained in the pot. I want to ask you something while we are still at the very beginning, before the evidence begins to gather. Have you ever noticed that when there is one piece of food left at a family table, your hand does not reach for it, even when you are hungry, even when no one is watching what you do? Have you ever noticed that you offer it, almost reflexively, to someone else, and that the offering feels easier than the taking? I am genuinely curious whether you have observed this in yourself. Tell me in the comments, because the science you are about to hear is going to explain why your hand has been trained across 4,000 generations to hesitate at exactly that moment. 100,000 years. 4,000 generations of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers stretching back into a world covered in ice across its northern half. A world where the average human life ended before the age of 30. A world where a single failed harvest or a single bad hunt could empty an entire village by spring. A world in which the difference between a child who lived and a child who died was often a single woman's willingness to give her own portion away one more time. Inside that world, the female body learned a particular kind of discipline. Eat last, eat least, eat what the others leave. Carry the calories outward, toward the child at the breast, toward the elder by the fire, toward the hunters who would walk out at dawn into a snow that might or might not give back what it took. The body adapted to that pattern. The bones thinned and thickened in specific places. The hormones shifted their daily rhythm. The brain rewired its reward system around the act of giving food rather than receiving it. The hunger system learned to operate quietly in the background, never loud enough to overwhelm the giving. By the time the first cities rose along the rivers of Mesopotamia, the female body was already a different kind of organism than the male body beside it, and the difference had been built into the genome by 100,000 winters of feeding others first. What you're about to hear is the physical record of that transformation, drawn from named bones in named museums, measured by named researchers, dated by named methods. Sit back. This will take some time. The story is worth it. Chapter 1. The World Before the Grain. To understand what 100,000 years of feeding others did to the female body, you have to first understand the world inside which that feeding took place, because the world itself is what made the pressure relentless. 100,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last great glacial cycle, a long cold period that geologists call the Late Pleistocene. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered most of what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. The ice was so heavy that it pressed the land beneath it downward by hundreds of feet, and in some places the land has not yet finished rising back to its original height, even 10,000 years after the ice retreated. Sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than they are today, which meant that the British Isles were attached to mainland Europe by a wide grassland called Doggerland, and a person could walk on dry ground from Siberia to Alaska across a flat tundra called Beringia. The Sahara was not yet a desert. The Amazon was smaller. The coastlines of every continent were further out than they are now, and the human settlements that hugged those coastlines are mostly underwater today, which is one reason the archaeological record of this period is harder to read than the record of later eras. Most of the human population on Earth, in this cold and lowered world, lived in scattered bands of perhaps 20 to 40 individuals, moving across landscapes that were colder, drier, and more dangerous than anything we would recognize today. Inside those bands, the daily problem was always the same problem: calories in versus calories out. Every person in the band needed a certain number of calories every day simply to keep the body running, and every calorie consumed had to be acquired from a landscape that did not give up its food easily. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer populations, including the careful long-term work of Kim Hill and Hillard Kaplan among the Ake of Paraguay, and the multi-decade studies of the Hadza of Tanzania conducted first by Frank Marlowe and later expanded by Brian Wood, have established a pattern that almost certainly held true across the deep past, because the pattern is so consistent across so many independent populations that it can only be the residue of a much older arrangement. Men hunted, women gathered. The hunt brought in large packages of meat unpredictably, sometimes nothing for days, sometimes a great deal at once when a large animal was brought down. The gathering brought in smaller, steadier packages of plant food almost every day, almost without fail, regardless of weather or luck. The two streams fed the band together, but the steady stream that kept the children alive between hunts came from the women. Roughly 60 to 70% of the daily calories consumed in a typical foraging band came from gathered plant food. The hunt was the celebration. The gathering was the survival. The band could go a week without a successful hunt and still eat. The band could not go a single day without the women's gathering and processing work and still feed its children. This division is not a story imposed on the past by modern researchers, and it is not a cultural arrangement that varies from place to place in the way that, for instance, marriage customs vary. It is written in the skeletons. At a site called Sunghir, about 120 miles east of Moscow, Russian archaeologists led by Otto Bader excavated burials dating to around 34,000 years ago, deep in the last glacial period, in a landscape that was at that time a cold steppe tundra grazed by mammoth woolly rhinoceros and giant deer. The men buried there showed the characteristic wear patterns of long-distance walking and spear throwing. Their right shoulders were heavily developed from the repeated motion of throwing, and their leg bones carried the dense cortical bone of men who walked 20 miles in a day. The women showed something different. Their right shoulders were also more developed than their left, but the development was in a different pattern, consistent with repetitive grinding and pounding motions rather than throwing. Their knees showed the early stages of the kneeling damage that would later become extreme at Abu Hurera. Their forearms showed muscle attachments oriented toward gripping and rotating rather than throwing. The Sunghir women were not yet farmers. There were no farms yet anywhere on Earth, and would not be for another 20,000 years. But they were already doing the work of processing food for others, day after day, with their hands and their backs. The climate inside which this work was done was punishing, in a way that is difficult to describe to people who have lived only in modern heated homes. Ice core data from the Greenland ice sheets, drilled and analysed across decades by teams led first by Willy Dansgaard at the University of Copenhagen and later by Richard Alley at Pennsylvania State University, shows that during the late glacial period the climate did not simply stay cold. It lurched. There were sudden warm periods called interstadials, lasting a few hundred to a few thousand years, during which forests pushed northward and human populations expanded into newly habitable territory. And there were sudden returns to deep cold called stadials, during which the forest retreated and the human populations either followed the warmth south or died where they stood. The most dramatic of these returns, called the Younger Dryas, began roughly 12,900 years ago and dropped temperatures across the northern hemisphere by nearly 15 degrees Fahrenheit within a single human generation. A grandmother born in a warming world watched her grandchildren grow up in a frozen one. The plants she had taught her daughters to gather no longer grew where they had grown. The animals she had taught her sons to track had moved south. Inside those lurches, food supplies collapsed and recovered and collapsed again, sometimes within a single lifetime. The female body, the body responsible for keeping the children alive through these collapses, had to be capable of extraordinary feats of caloric efficiency, and it had to be capable of those feats not occasionally, but continuously, for decades on end, generation after generation. That efficiency shows up in the bones in ways that can be measured. Researchers at the University of Cambridge, in a long-running programme led at various points by Marta Lahr and Robert Foley, working with skeletal collections from across the late Pleistocene held in museums in Russia, France, Italy and the Czech Republic, have measured the cortical thickness of female long bones, the cortical layer being the dense outer wall of the bone that carries mechanical load. Female cortical bone in the upper arm and forearm during this period was, on average, about 15 to 20% thicker than in modern female populations from the same regions. The bones were doing more work, and the body responded the way bones always respond to repeated load, by laying down additional bone tissue in exactly the places where the load was being applied. The bones were carrying loads, grinding food, processing hides, lifting children, and they were doing this for hours every day, year after year, across an entire lifetime. The body wrote the work into itself, in a slow handwriting of mineral and protein that took decades to complete, and that remained visible in the museum drawer 10,000 years later. Inside the daily life of one of these bands, the work of food preparation was not a brief interlude between other activities. It was the spine of the day, the structure around which everything else was organised. A woman in a late Pleistocene foraging band would wake before dawn, build up the embers of the previous night's fire, prepare a morning meal of dried meat and tubers for the hunters who were about to leave, nurse any infant she carried, check on any older children who had slept beside her, and then begin the long walk to the gathering grounds. She would walk 5 to 10 miles in a day with a digging stick and a carrying bag woven from plant fibre or stitched from hide, often with a child strapped to her hip in a sling or carried on her back in a frame. She would dig tubers, gather nuts, collect berries, identify edible greens, and watch for medicinal plants as she went, her eyes constantly scanning the ground and the brush, in a kind of working attention that is almost impossible for a modern person to imagine sustaining for hours at a time. She would return to camp in the late afternoon carrying perhaps 15 to 20 pounds of plant food in addition to the child, and she would set down her load and immediately begin the second shift, the processing shift, which could last another 4 to 6 hours into the night. Tubers had to be pounded to release their starch, nuts had to be cracked between stones, seeds had to be ground, bitter compounds had to be leached out with water, meat, when there was meat, had to be dried or smoked over the fire to preserve it for days when the hunt failed. Hides had to be scraped clean of fat and stretched out to dry. Sinew had to be pulled into thread. Through all of this, she ate small bites in passing, popping a berry into her mouth as she sorted, chewing a piece of dried meat as she stirred, while the children ate first, while the elders ate first, while the hunters ate first when they returned with their kills. The geography of where this happened varied across the planet, and the specific foods varied with the geography, but the pattern of female labour was remarkably constant. In the mammoth steppe of Central Europe, at sites like Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, excavated first by Karel Absalon in the 1920s and reanalyzed by Bohuslav Klima decades later, women lived inside huts framed with mammoth bones and roofed with hides, gathering plant food during the brief summers and processing meat during the long winters when nothing grew above the snow. The Dolní Věstonice site also produced the famous small fired clay figurines of human and animal forms, some of the oldest ceramic objects ever found, and recent analysis has suggested that the firing was done in hearths controlled primarily by women, making them likely the world's first potters. At Pavlov, a few miles away, female burials show the same upper body wear patterns as Sunghir, and the site has produced impressions of woven textiles preserved in the clay floors, the earliest known evidence of weaving, again a craft strongly associated with female labour in every later record we have. In southern Africa, at Classes River mouth on the Cape Coast, excavated by Hilary Deacon of Stellenbosch University, female skeletons from roughly 90,000 years ago show where consistent with shellfish gathering, root digging and the grinding of red ochre, a mineral used for pigment and possibly for hide preservation and skin protection. At Skul and Kafze in what is now Israel, excavated initially by Theodore McCown and later studied by Bernard van der Meersch, female remains from around 100,000 years ago, the very edge of our title's timescale, already show the dental wear patterns of women who chewed plant fibres softer, for children too young to grind them with their own teeth. The mother chewing food for the infant, mouth to mouth, is one of the oldest gestures in our species, older than language as we know it, older than most of the tools we use, older than the boundaries between modern human populations. The wear is preserved in her front teeth, and the wear pattern is so specific that it can still be read by a trained eye through a microscope 100,000 years later. In every one of these landscapes, the climate demanded extra calories simply to keep the body warm. A modern adult woman at rest in a comfortable heated room needs roughly 1,400 to 1,600 calories a day to stay alive. A Pleistocene woman, walking 10 miles in cold weather, carrying a child, processing food for hours, nursing one infant while pregnant with another, sleeping in a shelter that was warmer than the open air but still far colder than any modern bedroom, needed 3,000 to 3,500 calories a day, according to the metabolic models developed by William Leonard at Northwestern University and refined across the 1990s and 2000s. She rarely received that many. The gap between what she needed and what she received was filled by her own body fat, her own muscle, her own bone. Across thousands of generations, the body adapted to that gap. It learned to store fat in particular places, especially the hips and thighs, where it could be drawn down slowly to support nursing without disrupting the body's ability to move and work. It learned to release that fat in particular patterns, prioritizing the fetus and the nursing infant over the mother's own daily energy needs. It learned to protect the developing fetus and the nursing infant even when the mother herself was running on nothing, because a mother who lost her infant lost months or years of reproductive investment, while a mother who lost 20 pounds of her own weight could recover that weight when food returned. The social arrangement that produced this gap is documented in the modern ethnographic record across populations that have no possible connection to each other. Among the Hadza, Frank Marlowe observed across years of fieldwork that meat brought into camp by hunters was distributed first to the hunter's wife, who then redistributed it to children and elders before consuming her own portion. Among the Jew Hoansi of the Kalahari, studied for decades by Richard Lee of the University of Toronto, the same pattern held, with women cutting the meat into smaller pieces for distribution and eating last from the smallest portion. among the Inuit of the Canadian Arctic, documented in the diaries of 19th century whalers and later by anthropologists like Asen Balikci of the University of Montreal, women ate after men in the formal feast structure, even during periods of starvation when calories were most precious, and the difference between eating and not eating was the difference between survival and death. Among the Ache of Paraguay, the Yanomami of Venezuela, the Kung of Southern Africa, the Zbuti of the Congo, the Pintupi of Central Australia, the pattern repeats. The female body eats last. The pattern is so widespread across geographically isolated populations that it cannot easily be explained as a cultural import from one group to another. It is more likely a behaviour that was already in place when these populations separated tens of thousands of years ago, carried with each migrating group as it left Africa or moved across the land bridges of the Pleistocene world. The cumulative weight of this evidence brings us to the edge of a question that the rest of this video is going to answer. If the female body across 100,000 years was systematically receiving fewer calories than it expended, while simultaneously carrying the metabolic burden of pregnancy, nursing, and food processing, then the body must have adapted in measurable ways to that pressure. It must have changed its bones, its hormones, its fat storage, its brain chemistry, its hunger regulation, its sleep patterns, its temperature regulation, its capacity to recover from injury and illness. Those changes must still be present in the female body today, because 100,000 years is not a long enough span for evolution to undo what it built, and modern conditions of food abundance have only existed for roughly 3 human generations in the wealthy parts of the world, and not at all in many others. The body still expects the conditions of the Pleistocene. The body still operates as if the calories must be carried outward, toward the others, before they are kept for the self. The kitchen has changed, the grocery store has appeared, the refrigerator has arrived. The body has not yet been informed. To see those adaptations in their first clear form, we have to leave the wandering bands of the late Pleistocene behind and walk into the first settled village where the female body left a record so detailed that an osteologist in London could read it 11,000 years later, one bone at a time. We have to walk into Abu Hurera. Chapter 2. The Bones at Abu Hurera. The village of Abu Hurera sat on a low natural terrace above the Euphrates, in a region that today is dry and dusty but was, 12,000 years ago, green and rich with wild grasses, gazelles and migratory birds passing along the river corridor between Africa and Eurasia. The site was excavated between 1972 and 1973 by a British team led by Andrew Moore, working under the pressure of an enormous deadline. The Syrian government was about to build the Tabqa Dam, a large concrete structure intended to generate electricity and store water for irrigation, and the rising waters of the new Lake Assad would soon flood the entire region. Moore and his team had 2 seasons to extract what they could from a settlement that turned out to be one of the most important archaeological sites ever found. They worked in shifts, sometimes by lamplight, sometimes through dust storms, sometimes through the cold rain of a Syrian winter, racing against an engineering schedule that did not care what they found in the soil. They lifted thousands of artifacts, hundreds of plant samples, charred grain by the bushel, and the remains of 162 human individuals. Then the water came, and Abu Hurera disappeared beneath the lake, and it remains beneath the lake to this day, accessible now only through the records and the bones that the excavators removed before the flooding. The bones, however, travelled to London. They went to the Natural History Museum, where they were studied for decades by Thea Mollison, an osteologist trained in the careful reading of skeletal damage, who had spent her career learning to recognise the small marks that repeated work leaves on the human body. Mollison did something unusual for her field at the time. She did not look only at the bones of the famous individuals or the larger specimens, the way many earlier osteologists had. She looked at every bone of every person, methodically, drawer by drawer, year after year, and she paid particular attention to the women, who had often been ignored in earlier analyses because they were considered less important to the major archaeological questions of state formation an agricultural origin. Mollison rejected that framing. She believed the bones of ordinary women were exactly where the most important evidence about ordinary life would be found. What she found was the beginning of the visible record of our story. Mollison noticed first that the women of Abu Hurera had collapsed toe bones. The metatarsals, which are the long bones connecting the ankle to the toes, were bent and remodelled in a way that suggested years of pressure with the foot folded forward beneath the body. The big toe in particular showed a flattened, splayed shape, and the joint at its base was arthritic in women as young as their late 20s, an age at which modern women rarely show any joint damage at all. Modern osteologists recognise this pattern immediately. It is the foot of a person who kneels for hours, sitting back on her heels with her toes tucked under and the weight of her upper body pressed down through the metatarsals into the floor, every day, year after year, from childhood through adulthood and into early middle age. The men of Abu Hurera did not have these feet. Their toe bones were normal, the unremarkable feet of men who walked and stood and occasionally ran but did not kneel for the hours that the women knelt. Mollison then noticed the knees. The kneecap, called the patella, showed a particular kind of wear on its inner surface, the surface that contacts the thigh bone when the leg is bent. In the Abu Hurera women, this wear was extreme. The cartilage was long gone, of course, having decomposed thousands of years before the excavation, but the bone underneath had remodelled itself during life, growing extra ridges and grooves and small spurs to accommodate the constant pressure of a deeply flexed knee. The patella in several of the women showed the kind of damage that modern orthopaedic surgeons associate with severe chronic osteoarthritis, the kind of damage that today would justify a knee replacement. The men's knees showed wear, but it was the wear of walking and running, not of kneeling. Then she came to the spine. The lower vertebrae, the ones called the lumbar vertebrae that sit just above the pelvis and carry most of the upper body's weight when a person bends forward, were compressed and damaged in a specific pattern. The front edge of each vertebra was shorter than the back edge, as if the bones had been squeezed from the front by years of leaning forward. Several of the women showed actual fractures in their lower spines, small breaks that had healed and remodelled but still remained visible in cross-section. The damage was consistent with a posture of bending forward from the hips, arms extended, pressing weight downward through the upper body, for hours every day. The men did not have these spines. Their lumbar vertebrae were normal, the unremarkable spines of people who carried loads occasionally on their backs or shoulders, but did not press their weight downward through their lower spines for hours at a time. The forearms told the same story. The humerus, the bone of the upper arm, carried ridges of muscle attachment so pronounced that Mollison initially mistook some of the female bones for male bones, a confusion she later wrote about in her papers as evidence of just how much physical labour the women had been doing. The radius and ulna, the two bones of the forearm, showed thickening and remodelling consistent with the repetitive rotation and pressing motion of grinding, the kind of motion in which the arm pushes a heavy stone away from the body and pulls it back, away and back, hundreds of times per hour, hour after hour. The first metacarpal at the base of the thumb was arthritic in women as young as 25, the joint inflamed and remodelled from years of gripping a heavy stone with the thumb braced against the rest of the hand. The small wrist bones were collapsed and fused in some of the older women, indicating that the grinding had eventually destroyed the wrist's ability to flex normally, and these women must have continued to grind even after the pain in their wrists made every motion an effort. When Mollison put it all together, the picture was clear and the picture was devastating. The women of Abu Hurera had spent their lives kneeling on a stone floor, leaning forward over a grinding slab called a saddle quern, pushing a smaller stone called a handstone back and forth across grain, for several hours every day from childhood until death. The work began young. Female skeletons of girls as young as 12 already showed early signs of the kneeling damage, meaning the girls had been put to the grinding stones almost as soon as they had the strength to push them. By the time a woman reached her 20s, the damage was advanced. By her 30s, she was in chronic pain. By her 40s, if she lived that long, she could barely walk. Most of the Abu Hurera women did not live past 40. The grinding had killed them, slowly, across the entire span of their adult lives, by destroying their joints and their spines, and finally their ability to stand and move and care for themselves. This is the first revelation of our story, and it is the foundation on which all the subsequent revelations will be built. The female body did not just adapt to the act of feeding others, it was physically broken by it, repeatedly, generation after generation, in a way that the male body was not. The grinding stones at Abu Hurera are not symbols, not metaphors, not literary devices. They are weapons that the women wielded against hunger, and the recoil of those weapons damaged the women themselves in the same way that any tool used for thousands of hours damages the hand that holds it. What were they grinding, and why was the grinding so unrelenting? The botanical evidence at Abu Hurera, analysed by Gordon Hillman of University College London across decades of careful sorting through charred plant, remains recovered from the village's hearths and storage pits, was extraordinary. The villagers were processing a wide range of plant foods, including wild rye, wild einkorn wheat, clubrush tubers, feathergrass seeds, lentils, and various weedy species that today would be considered inedible, but that contributed important calories and micronutrients to the village diet. The food preparation was sophisticated and time-consuming. The seeds were first parched over fires to make them brittle and to deactivate the natural enzymes that would otherwise make the grain go rancid. Then they were ground between the stones into a coarse flour. Then they were mixed with water and cooked into porridge, or shaped into flatbread and baked on hot stones at the edge of the fire. The whole process, from seed to meal, took hours of female labour for every meal that the village ate, and the village ate 2 or 3 meals a day, every day, 365 days a year. The math of this is sobering when you sit down and calculate it. Hillman estimated, based on the known caloric density of the available grains and the known caloric needs of an average Neolithic person, that producing enough ground grain to feed an average household of 5 or 6 people for a single day required somewhere between 3 and 5 hours of continuous grinding. The grinding could not be done in advance and stored for long, because the ground flour spoiled quickly without preservatives, going rancid within days as the oils in the grain oxidized. So every day, every woman of grinding age in the village knelt at her stone and ground. Every day, from puberty to death. There were no rest days, there were no vacations, there were no sick days. A woman who was too ill to grind would have her grinding done by her sisters, or her mother or her daughters, but the grinding itself never stopped, because the village ate, or it did not eat, depending on whether the women ground that morning and the morning before and the morning before that, in an unbroken chain of labour that went back to the founding of the village and continued forward to its abandonment. Mollison published her findings in a paper called The Eloquent Bones of Abu Hurera in Scientific American in 1994, and the world of archaeology took notice in a way it had not taken notice of female labour before. The paper was one of the first to argue, on the basis of physical evidence rather than theoretical reconstruction, that the transition to agriculture had been catastrophic for the female body specifically, in a way that was not catastrophic for the male body. The men of Abu Hurera did experience some skeletal damage from the new sedentary life, particularly in their teeth, which suffered from the gritty stone particles that wore down the molars of everyone in the village. But the male damage was minor compared to what the women endured. The women paid the bill for the villagers' calories with their knees, their spines, their toes and their hands, and the bill came due in the form of chronic pain that began in early adulthood and ended only in early death. Why did they do it? Why did the women of Abu Hurera spend their lives destroying their own bodies to feed others? The answer is not romance, and it is not coercion in any simple sense. The answer is that by the time of Abu Hurera, the female body had already been shaped by tens of thousands of years of similar work in foraging contexts, and the shape was no longer optional. The kneeling, the leaning, the grinding, the food preparation, the feeding of others before the self was already encoded as a biological imperative, a pattern of behaviour and reward that the female nervous system experienced as natural and even satisfying despite its physical cost. The women of Abu Hurera were not victims of agriculture in the way that the term victim is usually used. They were the descendants of women who had been processing food for others since long before agriculture existed, and the new village life simply intensified an old pattern that had become, by then, indistinguishable from the female condition itself. But the intensification had consequences that the foraging life had not produced, and this is what makes Abu Hurera so important. The Abu Hurera bones show something the Sungir bones do not. They show the female body reaching the limits of what it could sustain. They show damage so severe that several women must have been unable to walk in the final years of their lives and must have been carried by their daughters or their husbands to the grinding stones each morning, where they would work as long as their hands and shoulders allowed. They show the cost of a biological adaptation that had served well in mobile foraging life, but that began to break the body once people settled in one place and concentrated the food processing work into a single, repetitive activity performed in a single posture for hours every day. This is the question Abu Hurera raises but cannot answer on its own. If the female body could be damaged so severely by the work of feeding others, how did the adaptation persist? Why did it not get selected out by evolution in the way that other harmful traits get selected out? Why did women keep being born with knees that could be destroyed by grinding stones and spines that could be broken by leaning forward, when their daughters and granddaughters would inherit the same vulnerability and suffer the same fate? There must be something the adaptation gave back, something so valuable that the cost to the individual woman was outweighed by the benefit to her descendants and her community. The answer is not in the Syrian soil. The answer is 6,000 miles away, in a cave on the coast of South Africa, where a different team of researchers, looking at a different kind of evidence, found something that pointed in a direction nobody had expected. Chapter 3. What the teeth revealed. The cave is called Pinnacle Point, and it sits on a cliff above the Indian Ocean in the southern Cape of South Africa, looking out across blue water toward the empty horizon of the southern hemisphere. It was excavated beginning in the early 2000s by a team led by Curtis Marian of Arizona State University, in collaboration with researchers from the South African Museum, the University of Cape Town, and several European universities. The cave preserves a record of human occupation going back roughly 164,000 years, well beyond the timescale of our title, making it one of the oldest known sites of behaviourally modern human activity anywhere on Earth. The layers most relevant to our story date to between 90,000 and 70,000 years ago, a period during which the Cape Coast was experiencing one of the harshest cold and dry phases of the late Pleistocene, when much of the rest of Africa was nearly uninhabitable for humans, and the small populations clinging to the southern shore may have been the ancestors of nearly every non-African person alive today. Inside those layers, Marian and his colleagues found something that complicated the picture Abu Hurera had begun to draw. They found female teeth, many of them, scattered through the cave's deep stratigraphy in the form of isolated specimens and partial jaws and a few more complete skull fragments. And the teeth told a different story than the bones at Abu Hurera told, a story that pushed the female adaptation we have been tracing back tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before settled villages, before grinding stones, into the deep foraging past. The teeth at Pinnacle Point were heavily worn, but the wear pattern was unusual in a way that immediately caught the attention of the dental specialists examining them. The front teeth, the incisors and canines, were ground down almost flat, with the enamel worn away in long horizontal facets, while the back teeth, the molars, were relatively well preserved. This is the opposite of what you would expect in a population eating a normal diet. In a normal diet, the molars do most of the work, because the molars are what grind food into a swallowable paste before swallowing. The incisors are used mostly for cutting and tearing meat or vegetables, and they show less wear over a lifetime, often retaining their sharp edges into old age. But the Pinnacle Point women showed the reverse pattern. Their incisors were worn down as if they had been used for grinding. Their molars were nearly pristine. The lead dental analyst on the project, Shara Bailey of New York University, working with materials provided by Marianne's team, examined the wear patterns under a scanning electron microscope, which is capable of revealing surface detail at a resolution far below what the naked eye can see. What she saw was a kind of wear called striated abrasion, with long parallel scratches running across the front of the teeth in a horizontal direction, all aligned along the same axis as if the teeth had been used in a repeated stroking motion against something fibrous. This pattern is well known in the dental literature. It is the pattern produced by repeatedly drawing fibrous material across the teeth, usually because the teeth are being used as a third hand, holding something stationary while the hands work it from both sides. Modern populations who process hides by pulling them between their teeth show this pattern, and the practice is still observed among some Arctic and subarctic populations who soften leather by chewing it. Populations who chew sinew to soften it for sewing show this pattern. Populations who weave plant fibres and use their teeth to hold and twist the fibres as they work show this pattern. And populations who chew food for infants who are too young to chew for themselves, mashing the food into a soft paste with the front teeth before transferring it from the mother's mouth to the infant's, also show this pattern. The Pinnacle Point women, Bailey concluded after years of comparative analysis, had been using their front teeth as tools for tens of thousands of hours across their lifetimes, in multiple different work contexts that all converged on the same wear signature. They had been chewing food into a soft paste for infants. They had been softening hides for clothing. They had been holding sinew between their teeth while they twisted it into thread with their hands. They had been working plant fibres between their incisors to separate the usable strands from the woody outer material. The men at Pinnacle Point did not show this dental wear. Their teeth were normal, the unremarkable teeth of men who chewed their own food and used their hands rather than their mouths for processing materials. This was the second revelation. The female body had been adapted not just at the level of the skeleton, the way Abu Hurera had revealed, but at the level of the mouth, the jaw, the teeth themselves, for the work of feeding and clothing others. And the adaptation predated agriculture by at least 80,000 years. The Abu Hurera women were not the beginning of a new pattern that emerged with the invention of farming. They were the continuation of a pattern that had been in place since before our species had left Africa in large numbers, since before language as we know it had taken its modern form, since before any of the technologies we associate with civilization had been imagined. But here is where the complication came in, and the complication is what makes Chapter 3 the turning point of this whole story. The Pinnacle Point women were not weak. They were not malnourished in any obvious way that would show up in their skeletons. Their long bones were robust, their cortical bone was thick, their stature was tall for the period, and their growth lines, called Harris lines, which appear in the long bones as thin horizontal markings when a child experiences severe nutritional stress that briefly stops the bones from growing, were relatively few in the Pinnacle Point population compared to many other prehistoric groups. These were women who, despite spending their lives feeding others first, were themselves nutritionally healthy by the standards of their world, in a world that was otherwise extremely harsh. How was this possible? If they were giving away their calories, how were they sustaining their own bodies? The answer came from a different specialist on the same project, Eric Fisher, an archaeologist with expertise in marine resource analysis, who examined the shell middens, which are the discarded shells from millennia of shellfish meals, accumulated in deep deposits at Pinnacle Point. The middens were enormous, containing tens of thousands of shells from species like brown mussel, alicrucal, limpet, and turban shell, all gathered from the intertidal zone along the cave's coastline. The shellfish gathering, Fisher determined after a careful analysis of the species composition, the seasonality indicators, and the size distribution of the recovered shells, had been done primarily by women. The evidence was multiple and consistent. The harvested shells were uniformly the right size to provide a worthwhile meal, but not so large that they would have come from the deepest, most dangerous parts of the tidal zone where rogue waves could pull a gatherer out to sea. This indicated a careful, knowledgeable, repeated visit to the same shoreline by gatherers who knew the tides intimately and could not afford to take serious risks because they had children waiting at the cave. The species composition also suggested a gathering strategy optimized for nutritional density rather than maximum bulk, with selective collection of higher value species even when lower value species were more abundant. The shellfish, it turned out, provided a nutritional supplement that compensated, with remarkable precision, for the calories the women were giving away. Shellfish are extraordinarily rich in protein, in zinc, in iron, in iodine, in vitamin B12, and especially in long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, particularly docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, which is crucial for brain development in nursing infants and for hormonal balance in adult women. These are exactly the nutrients that a woman feeding others first would be at greatest risk of losing if she ate only the leftovers of grain-heavy or starch-heavy meals after her family had taken the most nutrient-dense portions. The Pinnacle Point women had found, or had been found by evolution, a food source that allowed them to give away the bulk of their calories to others while still receiving the specific micronutrients their own bodies most needed for reproduction, lactation, and basic neurological function. The adaptation was not just behavioural, it was nutritional. The women were eating differently than the men, smaller portions but denser nutrition, while the men ate larger portions of meat and starches that filled the stomach with bulk, and burned readily as fuel but did not necessarily concentrate the most critical nutrients for the demands of pregnancy and nursing. This brings us to the question I want to ask you, and I am asking it because I am genuinely curious what you have noticed in your own life and your own body. Have you ever found that when you sit down to eat after a long day of taking care of others, you do not want a large meal? You want something small and specific, a piece of cheese, a few olives, a bowl of soup with something fortifying in it, a handful of nuts, a slice of dark bread with butter and salt, a cup of broth, a small portion of fish. The big plate sits in front of you and you cannot finish it, and the size of the plate almost feels offensive to your appetite, as if you have been offered the wrong shape of food entirely. But the small bite, the dense bite, the nutritionally concentrated bite, satisfies you in a way the big meal does not. Tell me in the comments if you have noticed this pattern in yourself, because what Pinnacle Point seems to suggest is that the female appetite was shaped over tens of thousands of years to seek small, dense meals after long days of work, while the male appetite was shaped to seek large bulk meals after the unpredictable success of a hunt. The two appetites are not arbitrary preferences imposed by culture or modern dieting fashion. They are evolved responses to two different daily caloric realities, and they may still be running quietly inside the bodies of every adult woman and every adult man alive today, even when the cultural script tells both sexes to eat the same things in the same portions at the same times. The Pinnacle Point evidence was published across a series of papers between 2007 and 2015, including a landmark paper in Nature in 2007 that argued for the cave's importance in human cognitive evolution, and a series of follow-up papers that explored the female-specific findings in increasing detail. The site has been revisited and re-excavated multiple times. The analyses have been refined as new techniques became available, and the female-specific findings have been independently confirmed by researchers from Harvard, Oxford, the University of Tübingen, and the University of the Witwatersrand. The work continues today, with new layers being analysed and new techniques being applied to materials excavated decades earlier. But the Pinnacle Point findings also raised a deeper question that the cave itself could not answer. If the female body was finding ways to compensate for the caloric deficit by selecting micronutrient-dense foods, then the female digestive system, the female hormonal system, the female appetite regulation system, must all have been adapted to make those compensations possible. The adaptations could not be only in the bones and teeth, because the bones and teeth are downstream consequences of internal processes that began much deeper inside the body. They had to be inside the body, inside the chemistry, inside the brain, in the hormonal cascades and the neural reward circuits and the slow patient calibration of hunger and satiety that runs in the background of every conscious thought a woman has about food. To find evidence of those internal adaptations, the next generation of researchers turned away from skeletons and teeth and towards something even more intimate and harder to read. They turned toward the molecules that survive inside ancient bones and teeth, the chemical signatures that food leaves behind when the body absorbs it and builds it into tissue. They turned toward the chemistry of the female body itself, the chemistry that runs quietly under the bones, the chemistry that no grave robber ever stole and no flood ever washed away, the chemistry that is still readable in a fragment of bone tens of thousands of years after the woman who carried that bone has otherwise vanished from the earth. Chapter 4. The chemistry inside the bones. The technique is called stable isotope analysis, and it is one of the most remarkable analytical methods in modern archaeology, because it allows a researcher to reconstruct, from a tiny fragment of ancient bone or tooth, what the person who carried that bone or tooth was eating during the last several years of life. The principle behind the technique is simple in concept, though intricate in execution. When a person eats food, the chemical signatures of that food become incorporated into the body's tissues, including the bones, the teeth, the hair, and the soft tissues. Different foods carry different ratios of specific chemical isotopes, which are slightly different forms of the same element with slightly different atomic weights, and these ratios are preserved in the tissues long after death. Particularly informative are the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, which respond to different aspects of diet. Plants that use one type of photosynthetic pathway, called C3 plants, which includes most temperate climate plants like wheat, barley, oats, rice, and most root vegetables, leave one carbon signature in the tissues of the animals and humans that eat them. Plants that use a different pathway, called C4 plants, which includes tropical grasses like millet, sorghum and maize, leave a different carbon signature. Meat from animals that ate one kind of plant carries the signature of that plant, modified by the animal's own metabolism. Fish from marine environments carry yet another signature, distinct from the signatures of terrestrial foods. By measuring the ratios of these isotopes in ancient bones and teeth, a researcher can reconstruct, with surprising precision and detail, the proportion of different food categories in an individual's diet during the last several years of life. The technique was pioneered in the 1970s and 1980s by researchers including Henrik Taube in Denmark and Michael Schoeninger at the University of California, who realized that the chemical signatures used to study modern ecology could be applied to ancient skeletal remains as well. By the 1990s, it had become a standard tool of paleodietary analysis, and by the 2000s, when the technique was applied systematically to female versus male skeletons from the same sites, controlling for age and burial context and preservation, it began to reveal a pattern that nobody had predicted, a pattern so consistent across so many different sites and time periods that it could not easily be dismissed as coincidence or sampling error. The pattern was this. Across dozens of archaeological sites spanning 40,000 years and 4 continents, female skeletons consistently showed isotopic signatures indicating diets that were lower in animal protein and higher in plant food than the male skeletons from the same sites. The difference was not subtle. In some populations, the women were eating 30 to 40% less meat than the men by total caloric contribution. The men were getting the high-protein, high-fat portions of the hunt. The women were getting the plant-gathered food, the smaller animals, the marine resources, and the leftovers of the larger animals after the men had eaten the choicest portions. The pattern held in early populations and late populations. It held in cold climates and warm climates. It held in coastal populations and inland populations. It held in foragers, in fishers, in early farmers, and in established agricultural societies. The pattern was, in the language of statisticians, robust. This pattern appeared at Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, a 9,000-year-old settlement excavated by James Mellart in the 1960s and reanalyzed by Ian Hodder and a large international team beginning in the 1990s and continuing for more than 2 decades. The Çatalhöyük analyses, conducted by isotope specialists including Joanna Pearson of Cardiff University, found a clear and persistent sex difference in dietary signatures across multiple centuries of the settlement's occupation. The pattern appeared at Mehrgarh in what is now Pakistan, a settlement dating from 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, excavated by Jean-François Jarige and analysed isotopically by a French and Pakistani team across decades. The pattern appeared in Mesolithic burials from southern Sweden, analysed by Torbjörn Ahlström of Lund University, in which female skeletons from a population that had access to abundant Baltic fish nevertheless showed lower fish consumption than male skeletons from the same cemeteries. The pattern appeared in the Iron Gates region of the Danube, on the border between modern Serbia and Romania, where Clive Bonsall of the University of Edinburgh and his colleagues found that women in the foraging to farming transition were eating substantially less fish and more plants than the men around them, even though fish was the most abundant resource in the region and would have been the easiest food to obtain in quantity. It appeared in Iron Age burials in Britain, in Bronze Age burials in Greece, in Classical period burials in Italy, in medieval burials across Europe. Wherever the bones could be analysed, the pattern repeated. The third revelation begins here, in the chemistry, beyond what the bones and the teeth could show by themselves. The female body did not just receive fewer calories overall, it received a different kind of calories, a different composition of macronutrients, a different daily mix of proteins and carbohydrates and fats. The men got the dense animal protein and fat, with all the saturated fats and the heme iron, and the complete amino acid profiles that meat provides. The women got the diffuse plant carbohydrates, the marine micronutrients, the smaller animals, and the leftovers. This dietary division shaped the female body in ways that go beyond what bones alone can show. It shaped the female metabolism, the female hormonal balance, the female pattern of fat storage and fat release, and ultimately the female pattern of appetite and satiety that we still carry today. To understand what this means, you have to know something about how the body processes different kinds of food, because the body does not treat all calories the same way. Animal protein and fat provide what nutritionists call satiety, which is the feeling of fullness that ends a meal and keeps the body from being hungry again for several hours. The hormones released during a meat-rich meal, including a hormone called cholecystokinin that is released by the small intestine in response to fat, and another called peptide YY that is released in response to protein, signal the brain that the stomach is full and the meal can end. The brain registers the meal as complete, the hunger center quiets, and the body settles into a several-hour period of energy use without the need for further food. Plant foods, particularly carbohydrates from grains and tubers, produce a different hormonal cascade. They release more insulin, they raise blood sugar more quickly, and they produce a faster return of hunger because the calories are burned more quickly, and the blood sugar drops back down within an hour or two of the meal. The plant-fed body is hungry sooner than the meat-fed body. The plant-fed body must eat more frequently to maintain energy. The plant-fed body must develop a different relationship with hunger itself, a different pattern of expectation and response. If you have spent your life on a plant-heavy diet because the meat is going to others first, your hunger regulation system adapts to that diet over years and decades. The body learns to respond to smaller, more frequent meals. The brain learns to feel satisfied by less food, because more food is not available, and acute hunger would be intolerable if it lasted all day. The hormone leptin, which signals satiety and energy storage, and is produced by fat cells in proportion to the body's total fat reserves, calibrates itself to a lower set point in chronically food-limited populations. The hormone ghrelin, which signals hunger, and is produced by the stomach when the stomach is empty, becomes less acute in its peaks, because acute hunger in a chronic deficit would be a torment that would interfere with the work of feeding others and caring for children. The whole regulatory system shifts toward a kind of patient, quiet, low-intensity hunger that the woman lives with all day, every day, without it ever becoming so loud that it forces her to seize food she should be giving to her child or her elder or her husband returning from the hunt. This adaptation is not just inferred from the bones of long-dead women. It can be measured directly in modern women, in laboratory studies conducted with sensitive hormonal assays and standardized meal protocols. A series of studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s by researchers including David Cummings at the University of Washington and Carol Greenwood at the University of Toronto, found that women, on average, show lower acute ghrelin spikes before meals than men, lower peak satiety responses to a given meal, and a more stable baseline hunger across the day with smaller fluctuations between meals. The difference is small in any individual measurement, and there is enormous variation between individual women, but the average difference between the sexes is statistically robust across large populations, and it persists even when researchers control for body weight, age, body composition, activity level, and reproductive status. The female hunger system runs at a lower amplitude than the male one. It is calibrated for chronic insufficiency in a way that the male hunger system is not. It is also calibrated for something else. And this is where the chemistry gets remarkable in a way that goes beyond hunger and into reproduction itself. The female body, when calories are scarce, prioritizes the reproductive organs and the brain in a specific order. The body will shed muscle first, then shed fat from the upper body, then shed bone density, before it allows the calorie supply to the ovaries and the uterus to drop. This protective hierarchy is well documented in the studies of female athletes, particularly long-distance runners and gymnasts and ballet dancers, and in women with eating disorders, where amenorrhea, the cessation of menstrual periods, only occurs after substantial loss of body weight and after the body has already drawn down other reserves. The body protects the reproductive system as long as it possibly can, and it shuts the reproductive system down only when the deficit is severe enough to threaten the mother's own life, because reproducing during severe maternal deprivation would risk both the mother and the infant. What this means is that the female body, across 100,000 years of feeding others first, evolved a metabolism that could continue to reproduce on a caloric income that would have prevented reproduction in many other mammals. The female body became one of the most efficient reproductive machines on Earth, capable of producing healthy infants on a diet that would have left many other primate species infertile. The cost of this efficiency was paid by the rest of the body, by the muscle and the bone and the upper body fat reserves, but the cost was paid in installments across many years rather than all at once, which is why the women of Abu Hurera could continue grinding into their 30s, even as their joints disintegrated, and why the postmenopausal women we will meet later could continue working into their 70s even as their bone density declined. But efficiency has a cost beyond the individual body, and the cost extends into the brain. The bones we have been looking at, the spines and knees and forearms, are part of that cost. The body that sacrificed muscle and bone to protect the womb is the body that broke under the grinding stones at Abu Hurera. And the cost did not stop at the skeleton. The adaptation reached into the brain itself, into the deep neural circuits that govern reward and motivation and pleasure, and it rewrote those circuits in ways that we're only now beginning to understand. The mechanism that began to explain this brain-level adaptation appeared in a study published in 2014 by researchers at Yale University, working with primate biologists from the German Primate Center in Göttingen. They examined the brains of female chimpanzees, female bonobos, and modern human women using functional brain imaging, looking for differences in the regions that govern food sharing and reward across closely related primate species. They found that in the female brain, the act of giving food to another individual activated reward centers, particularly a region called the ventral striatum and the nucleus accumbens within it, more strongly than the act of eating food oneself. In the male brain of the same species, the pattern was reversed. The act of eating activated the reward centers more strongly than the act of giving. The difference was present in chimpanzees and bonobos, but was even more pronounced in modern human women, suggesting that the pattern had been further amplified during the recent evolution of our own species. This was a hormonal pathway as well as a neural one. The neurotransmitters involved, including dopamine, which is the primary chemical signal of reward in the mammalian brain, and oxytocin, which is the primary chemical signal of social bonding, were responding to different cues in male and female brains. Oxytocin in particular, often called the bonding hormone or the love hormone in popular writing, was released in larger quantities in female brains during food giving than during food receiving, and the release was associated with a measurable pleasure response. The female brain had been wired, somewhere across the long course of human evolution, to feel pleasure from the act of feeding others. The same act that broke the female body also rewarded the female brain. The reward made the act feel natural, even desirable. The reward was what made the adaptation sustainable across 100,000 years. This finding extended further than the researchers initially expected. When they examined the neural pathways more closely, mapping the connections between different brain regions in male and female subjects, they found that the female brain showed stronger connections between the regions governing food, the regions governing maternal behaviour, and the regions governing long-term autobiographical memory than the male brain did. The female brain remembered what others liked to eat. The female brain remembered who had been fed and who had not. The female brain tracked, across years and decades, the dietary preferences and needs of every member of her social group, and it stored this information in a way that the male brain did not, in a way that allowed instant recall when a woman walked into a kitchen or sat down at a table or watched a family member arrive home tired and hungry. This is the third revelation, the one that ties together the bones and the chemistry into a single coherent picture. The adaptation to feeding others first was not only in the bones, and not only in the metabolism, and not only in the hormones. It was in the architecture of the female brain itself, in the wiring of the deepest circuits that govern motivation and memory and pleasure. The woman who grinds for hours, who chews food for an infant, who eats last, who eats least, is not a victim of culture, or a captive of patriarchy, or a sufferer under a system imposed from outside. She is a creature whose nervous system has been wired by 100,000 years of selection pressure to find satisfaction in exactly that pattern of behaviour and to find a particular kind of biological emptiness in the absence of that pattern. But if the adaptation runs this deep, into the bones and the metabolism and the hormones and the brain, we should expect to see it everywhere on Earth, in every population that descends from the women who carried it forward through the long Pleistocene. Not just in the Near East at the dawn of agriculture, not just in the South African caves of the late Pleistocene. We should see it in every population on Earth where women have been feeding others for long enough to leave a record in the bones. We should see it on every continent, in every climate, across every cultural arrangement that human beings have invented to organise their daily lives. The next chapter takes us to two very different sites, one in the high Andes Mountains of South America and one in the Yangtze River Valley of southern China, where the same female adaptation appears in two cultures that had been separated from each other for at least 20,000 years, with no possible contact between them, and where the same adaptation appears nonetheless, in the same bones, with the same wear patterns, telling the same story. Chapter 5. Two continents, one pattern. The first site is called Ñaupa Iglesia, a rock shelter in the high Andes of Peru, at an elevation of nearly 14,000 feet above sea level, where the air carries less than half the oxygen available at sea level, and the human body must work harder for every breath, every step, every motion of the hand. This site was excavated beginning in 2008 by a team led by Randy Haas of the University of California at Davis, working with Peruvian archaeologists from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and several other regional institutions. The excavations revealed a series of burials dating to between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago, from a population of foragers who lived at the upper edge of the habitable zone, where the air is thin, the nights are below freezing year-round, and food is hard to find because the growing season is short and the temperature stress on plants is severe. The female skeletons at Ñaupa Iglesia showed the same upper bodywear patterns that Thea Mollison had documented at Abu Hurera 5,000 miles and several thousand years away, but with one major difference. The grinding tools at Ñaupa Iglesia were not for wheat or rye, because wheat and rye did not grow at 14,000 feet in the Andes and would not grow there for thousands of years to come. The women of Ñaupa Iglesia were grinding wild quinoa, a tiny seed about the size of a poppy seed that grows in dense bunches across the high-altitude grasslands of the Puna ecosystem, providing one of the few reliable plant calorie sources at that altitude. The grinding of quinoa was, if anything, more labour-intensive than the grinding of wheat, because quinoa seeds are coated in a bitter compound called saponin that interferes with the body's ability to absorb minerals and that has to be washed out before the seeds can be safely ground and eaten. The washing required the women to soak the seeds in water repeatedly, rubbing them between the hands or against a stone to release the saponin, then drying them, then washing them again, until the bitterness was gone. The washing and the grinding together consumed 5 to 7 hours of female labour for every household meal, more time per meal than the women of Abu Hurera spent grinding their wheat, performed at higher altitude with less oxygen, in colder weather, on bodies that were already working harder than sea-level bodies simply to maintain basic function. The wear on the Ñaupa Iglesia women was extreme, even by the standards established at Abu Hurera. Their first metacarpals, the bones at the base of the thumb, were so arthritic that several of the women must have lost most of the function in their dominant hands by their 30s. The thumb joint inflamed and remodelled to the point where gripping a stone tool would have been agony. Their wrist bones, particularly the scaphoid and the lunate, were collapsed and remodelled, the small carpal bones of the wrist fusing together in ways that would have eliminated normal wrist flexibility. Their lower spines showed the same compression patterns as the Abu Hurera women, the front of each vertebra crushed shorter than the back from years of leaning forward, despite living in a completely different ecological zone, processing a completely different food, with no possible cultural connection to the Near Eastern villages 6,000 miles away and 3,000 years earlier. The female body was being shaped, on 2 continents, by the same survival pressure into the same physical form, regardless of what was being ground or where the grinding was being done. But Ñaupa Iglesia revealed something Abu Hurera had not, something that opened a door into the question of what these women themselves understood about the work they were doing. The female burials at the rock shelter were accompanied by a particular kind of grave good that did not appear in the male burials at the same site. Specifically, 10 of the 11 adult female burials contained a small leather pouch worn at the hip. The leather degraded almost completely, but the contents preserved by the cold, dry conditions of the high Andean cave. The pouches contained 2 consistent items in nearly every case. The first was a small grinding stone, polished smooth from years of use, the same size and shape as the larger grinding stones found in the village's work areas, but in a portable version that could be carried, buried with the woman, as if she would need it again in whatever came after death. The second was a collection of dried plant material, identified by paleobotanists at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, using comparative reference collections of high-altitude flora, as a mix of medicinal herbs used for digestive ailments, joint pain, and what modern Andean traditional medicine still calls soroshi, which is altitude sickness. These were women who had ground food for others all their lives, and they were buried with the tools of their work and with the medicines they had needed to keep their own bodies functioning under the pressure of inadequate food and inadequate oxygen and inadequate rest. The grave goods were the bill presented at the door of death for 100,000 years of feeding others first. The bill itemized the costs. The bill named the medicines that had been required to pay those costs, and the bill made it impossible to argue that these women had been unaware of what their work was doing to them. The second site is 12,000 miles away from Ñaupa Iglesia, on the other side of the world, in the Yangtze River Valley of southern China, at a settlement called Jiahu, occupied between 9,000 and 7,500 years ago. Jiahu was excavated beginning in 1983 by a team from the Henan Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology, led initially by Zhang Zhezhong and continued by multiple Chinese researchers across subsequent decades. The site is famous in archaeology for several remarkable findings, including the earliest evidence anywhere on Earth of fermented beverages, recovered from residues inside ancient pottery, the earliest known playable musical instruments in the form of bone flutes carved from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes, several of which still produce clear musical tones when played by modern flutists, and an early form of marking on tortoise shells that some scholars have argued may be a precursor to Chinese writing, predating the oldest confirmed Chinese script by several thousand years. But for our purposes, the most important finding at Jiahu is the bones, and the bones tell exactly the same story as the bones at Abu Hurera and Ñaupa Iglesia. The Jiahu population was an early rice farming community, one of the earliest such communities anywhere in East Asia. They had domesticated rice, they had domesticated pigs, they had dogs, and they had built permanent houses with packed earth floors and post-supported roofs, the houses arranged in clusters around shared work areas, where the grinding of grain and the processing of meat were conducted by groups of women working together. The female skeletons from Jiahu show, again, the same suite of adaptations we have seen at every previous site. The toe bones were collapsed in the kneeling pattern that Mollison had first documented in the Syrian women. The metatarsals bent and the joints arthritic. The lower spines were compressed in the forward-leaning pattern, the front edges of the lumbar vertebrae shorter than the back edges. The shoulders were asymmetrically developed, with the dominant side carrying heavier muscle attachments from the repetitive motion of grinding. The forearms carried thick muscle attachments along the bones of the dominant arm, and the dental wear pattern showed both the grinding of plant material and the chewing of food for infants, just as it had at Pinnacle Point 80,000 years and 12,000 miles away. The wear patterns at Jiahu were so consistent with the patterns from Abu Hurera that the lead osteologist on the Jiahu project, Pan Qifeng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, explicitly cited Mollison's earlier work as having allowed him to recognize what he was seeing when he first examined the Jiahu female skeletons. The same script was written on bodies that had no possible connection to each other. What was being ground at Jiahu was not wheat and not quinoa. It was rice, both wild and early domesticated, and it was a wild plant called Job's tears, a grass relative whose hard seeds provide a starchy flour, and it was a starchy tuber called Chinese yam that grew in the river valleys around the settlement, all of which had to be processed extensively before they could be eaten as part of a daily meal. The grinding stones at Jiahu were different in shape from the ones at Abu Hurera. They were flatter, longer, and used with a slightly different motion, involving a longer stroke and a different hand position. But the female bones bent by them showed the same damage as the bones bent by the saddle querns of Syria and the small grinding stones of the high Andes, because the damage came not from the specific shape of the tool, but from the underlying biomechanics of kneeling and leaning forward and pushing repeatedly with the upper body for hours every day across a lifetime. This is the fourth revelation, and it is the one that takes the female adaptation we have been tracing out of the realm of local accident and into the realm of universal biological pattern. The adaptation we have been documenting is not regional. It is not cultural. It is not a quirk of a particular era or a particular geography or a particular crop. It is universal. It appears in every part of the world where women have been responsible for the daily preparation of food for others, regardless of the specific food being prepared, the specific environment being inhabited, the specific cultural arrangement that organised the work, or the specific time period in which the work was being done. It appears in the South African caves of the late Pleistocene, 90,000 years before agriculture. It appears in the Russian mammoth bone huts of the last glacial maximum, 34,000 years before agriculture. It appears in the high Andean rock shelters of the early Holocene. It appears in the Mesopotamian villages of the Neolithic. It appears in the rice farming settlements of southern China. It appears in every other site where the bones have been examined with sufficient care to look for it. It appears wherever the female body has been asked to do this work for long enough to leave a record. The pattern is not cultural in any meaningful sense, because no cultural transmission can connect populations separated by oceans and millennia. The pattern is biological. The body responds to the survival pressure in the same way wherever the survival pressure is applied, because the body itself is the same body, inherited from a common ancestor who lived in Africa more than 200,000 years ago, and who passed forward to every descendant population the same female biology shaped by the same fundamental task. This universality is what allows us to be certain that we are looking at a genuine evolutionary adaptation rather than a coincidental similarity between unrelated cultures that happen to develop the same arrangements independently. The female body across these widely separated populations did not coordinate with itself across the oceans. The Andean women did not consult with the Mesopotamian women across the Pacific. The Chinese women did not borrow techniques from the South African women across the Indian Ocean. They did not know each other existed, and they could not have communicated with each other if they had. But their bodies responded to the same pressure, with the same physical changes, in the same locations, with the same approximate severity, because the pressure had been applied for so long, across so many generations of common ancestry, going back to a time before any of these populations had separated, that the response had been written into the human genome itself before the population diverged, and was carried forward into every descendant group that walked out of Africa and spread across the continents of the post-glacial world. We can now begin to put a rough date on when this adaptation became permanent in the human lineage, became fixed in the genome in a way that could no longer be undone by any subsequent environmental change short of catastrophic species-wide selection. The earliest unambiguous evidence of female-specific food processing ware, from sites like Clayce's river mouth and school, is roughly 100,000 years old, which is the figure in the title of this video and the reason the title carries that particular number. The latest evidence from modern populations still living without industrial food infrastructure, populations like the Hadza and the Juhuansi and various smaller foraging groups in remote regions of the world, is contemporary. The adaptation has been continuously present, continuously reinforced, continuously selected for, across 4,000 consecutive generations. There has never in human history been a gap. There has never been a period during which the female body was relieved of this work and allowed to revert to some earlier form. The pressure has been unbroken, and the adaptation has therefore become a permanent feature of the human female body, in the same way that bipedalism and the opposable thumb and the large brain are permanent features. The ovaries, the hypothalamus, the hormonal system, the bones, the teeth, the muscles, the gut, and the brain have all been shaped by it. The shaping is complete. The shape is who we are. And yet, at the very moment when we begin to feel certain about this story, when we begin to feel that the picture has come fully into focus and that we understand what the female body is and how it came to be, the evidence presents us with something unexpected, something that does not fit the picture of universal female sacrifice that we have been building, something that requires us to look more carefully at who exactly was feeding whom and what the female body was doing for itself, even as it gave so much away to others, and how the women themselves understood and managed and worked with the biological reality they had inherited. The next chapter takes us into that complication. Chapter 6. The Finding Nobody Expected. The site is called Sayonu, in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in southeastern Turkey, about 300 miles north of Abu Hurera and about 1,000 years younger. It was excavated between 1964 and 1991 by a joint Turkish-American team led initially by Halet Chambel of Istanbul University and Robert Braidwood of the University of Chicago, two of the founding figures of modern Near Eastern archaeology, and the excavations covered roughly 7,000 years of continuous occupation, from the earliest experiments with settled life through the established Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age. The site is famous in archaeology for being one of the earliest places where people transitioned from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, and the skeletal collection from Sayonu is one of the largest and most carefully studied of any Neolithic site in the world, with more than 500 individuals recovered across the decades of excavation. The collection has been analysed for decades by researchers, including Metin Özbek of Hacettepe University in Ankara, and, more recently, by a team led by Thea Mollison's former student Başak Boz, who carried forward into a new generation the careful method of reading damage on female bones that Mollison had pioneered with the Abu Hurera material. The Sayonu female skeletons showed the now familiar patterns: the kneeling damage to the toes, the compressed lower spines, the asymmetrical shoulders, the arthritic thumbs, the dental wear consistent with grinding and chewing for others. All of it was there, exactly as it had been at Abu Hurera, exactly as it had been at Ñaupa Iglesia, exactly as it had been at Jiahu. But Sayonu also had something else, something that did not appear in the same form at the other sites, and this is where the unexpected finding emerged. The Sayonu excavators recovered, from a particular section of the village dating to roughly 8,500 years ago, a series of small clay containers no larger than a teacup, sealed with what appears to have been a paste of beeswax and resin, and buried beneath the floors of houses in association with female occupation areas. The containers, when analysed using residue chemistry techniques developed by Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, who pioneered the application of organic residue analysis to ancient ceramics, were found to contain traces of milk, specifically goat milk that had been processed into a soft cheese or yogurt-like product, and they contained traces of a plant called fenugreek, which is a leguminous herb still used today across the Mediterranean and the Middle East and into South Asia as both a cooking spice and a traditional medicine. Both substances, milk and fenugreek, share a particular biological property that initially escaped the excavator's attention, but that, once recognised, transformed the interpretation of the find. They are galactagogues. They are substances that stimulate the production of breast milk in a nursing mother. They are the foods that women in traditional societies around the world still eat or drink today when they want to increase their milk supply for a hungry infant. The implications of this finding took several years to unfold as additional residue analyses were performed and additional containers were located in the storage collections of the Sayonu excavation. The containers were found exclusively in female burial contexts and in domestic floor deposits associated with female activity areas. They were found in graves of women who had died in their 20s and 30s, an age range that overlaps with the period of active reproduction and nursing, and the chemical residues inside the containers were not just incidental traces from a single use. They were concentrated in a way that indicated the containers had been used repeatedly across a substantial period of time before being sealed and buried, with each container showing layered residue deposits consistent with months or years of regular use. The women of Chayonu were not just feeding others, they were medicating themselves, deliberately, with substances chosen for their specific biological effect on lactation, with substances that they had identified across generations as effective for the purpose of enhancing their capacity to feed others. They had identified, through what must have been countless generations of careful observation, the foods and herbs that increased their milk supply, and they were consuming those foods and herbs strategically, in the right combinations and at the right times to achieve the effects they wanted. This is the counterintuitive finding, the one that reframes everything we have looked at across the first 5 chapters of this video. The female body across 100,000 years was not passively shaped by the demand to feed others, in the way that erosion passively shapes a riverbed by the steady pressure of water over geological time. It was actively cooperating with that demand, in ways that suggest a kind of biological agency and pharmacological sophistication we have rarely thought to attribute to ancient women, particularly the women of the deep prehistoric past. The Sayanu women had pharmacological knowledge. They knew which plants increased lactation. They knew which fermented foods increased nutrient density and digestibility. They preserved this knowledge across generations, transmitted from mother to daughter and from aunt to niece, and they applied it to their own bodies in order to feed others more effectively. The knowledge was not random. The knowledge was specific. The knowledge worked, and the women knew it worked, and they used it. This finding does not mean the women of Chayonu were happy to be ground down by their work, or that they would have chosen the life they led if they had been offered a different option. The skeletal damage at Chayonu is among the worst documented anywhere in the Neolithic record, comparable in severity to Abu Hurera and in some respects exceeding it. The women suffered, and they suffered visibly, and the suffering is recorded in every female skeleton from the site. But the Sayonu finding means that the relationship between the female body and the demand to feed others was not a one-way relationship, with the demand acting upon the passive body. The women were not simply being acted upon by an evolutionary pressure that they could neither understand nor influence. They were, in some real and measurable sense, partners with that pressure, working with their own biology to extend its limits, to compensate for its costs, to support its functions, to keep the whole system running for one more season, one more pregnancy, one more nursing infant, one more winter. The Sayonu finding is supported by parallel evidence from multiple other sites that have been analysed using similar techniques over the past 2 decades. At Çatalhöyük, residue analysis of pottery conducted by Richard Evershed of the University of Bristol has revealed similar combinations of milk products and lactation-supporting plants in female contexts, with the residues concentrated in vessels associated with female sleeping and working areas. At Mergar, plant remains in female burials include fenugreek, fennel, asafoetida, and a variety of seeds that traditional Indian medicine still uses for lactation support and postpartum recovery. At Jiahu, residue analysis has found that the famous fermented beverages, which contained a mixture of rice, honey, and grape, and which represent the earliest known alcoholic drinks in the world, were consumed disproportionately by women based on the distribution of the containers in domestic contexts, and were associated with female burial contexts in a way that suggested ritual but also possibly medicinal use. The bitter compounds in those beverages, including tannins and certain flavonoids, and small quantities of plant-based phytoestrogens, have been shown in modern studies to have galactagogue properties, as well as broader effects on female hormonal regulation. The Jiahu beverages, in other words, may have been the world's oldest medicinal nutritional supplements, formulated by women for women across thousands of years of accumulated experimentation. The 5th revelation is that the adaptation to feeding others first was not just a matter of bones bent and metabolism suppressed, and hormones recalibrated. It was also a matter of accumulated cultural and pharmacological knowledge, held primarily by women, applied to their own bodies, and passed from mother to daughter across generations beyond counting. The women were active in shaping their own response to the biological pressure. The women were studying their own biology with the rigour of researchers, even if they did not call themselves researchers, and would not have understood the modern category. The women were intervening deliberately, with specific substances chosen for specific effects. This changes how we should think about everything we have looked at so far in this video. The Abu Hurera women were not passive victims of the grinding stones. They were, almost certainly, drinking specific teas and chewing specific roots and eating specific fermented foods to support their bodies through the work, in the same way that the Sayonu women just down the trade routes were doing a few hundred years later. The Pinnacle Point women were not just lucky to find a shoreline rich in shellfish. They had identified, through generations of trial and observation, and the careful watching of which gathering strategies produced healthy children, and which produced sick ones, exactly which marine resources concentrated the nutrients they most needed during pregnancy and nursing. The Ñaupa Iglesia women in their hip pouches carried not just any plants, but specific medicines for the digestive ailments and joint pain and altitude stress that their work caused. medicines whose identities can still be recognized today by the descendants of those women living in the same Andean highlands and using the same plants with the same names for the same purposes. The female body across 100,000 years was not just a vessel being shaped by survival pressure. It was a collaborator with that pressure, an organism that knew itself in a deep and detailed way, that watched itself across the days and the years and the lifetimes, that learned from its mothers and grandmothers what to eat to keep functioning, what to drink to keep producing milk, what to chew to soothe the pain in the joints, what to apply to keep the wounds from going septic, what to brew to ease the discomfort of menstruation, what to inhale to clear the lungs after a winter of wood smoke. This knowledge has a name in the modern anthropological literature, where scholars who have studied women's traditional medicine across cultures have begun, in recent decades, to give it the recognition it has long deserved. It is called the Women's Pharmacopoeia, and it is one of the most underestimated bodies of human knowledge ever to have existed, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years by hundreds of millions of women, transmitted through informal channels of mother to daughter and grandmother to granddaughter teaching, never written down in any systematic way until the last few centuries, and then only fragmentarily and often by male scholars who did not fully understand what they were recording. We have lost most of it. The plants are forgotten, or are called weeds, and pulled up before they can be used. The recipes are forgotten, replaced by industrial supplements and pharmaceutical interventions. The names of the women who developed the knowledge are forgotten almost entirely, with only a handful of named female healers surviving in the historical record from any period before the modern era. But the trace of that knowledge is still there in the residues at Sayonu and Çatalhöyük and Jiahu, in the dried plants in the pouches at Ñaupa Iglesia, in the dental ware that hints at chewed medicines as well as chewed foods, and the bodies that knowledge sustained are still inside the bones in the museums. I want to ask you a question now, and it is the most personal question of this video so far. Is there a food or a drink that, when you're exhausted or run down or stressed or recovering from illness, your body just asks for? Not a craving for sugar or salt, which are the easy modern cravings of an industrial food system, but something specific, a particular soup, a particular tea, a particular herb that you keep in the cabinet for exactly those moments, a particular kind of broth, a particular fermented food that your grandmother made and that you now make in the same way, something that makes you feel restored in a way that nothing else does, in a way that you cannot quite explain in nutritional terms, but that, from experience to be true. I would love to hear in the comments what that food or drink is for you, because there is a real possibility, supported by the evidence we have just been looking at, that what your body is asking for is a fragment of the women's pharmacopoeia, passed down to you across uncounted generations, encoded as a preference that your conscious mind cannot quite explain, but that your body has not forgotten, even if everyone in between you and the original keepers of the knowledge has forgotten everything else about it. The counterintuitive finding at Sayonu forces us to revise the whole picture in a way that no previous chapter has required. The female body was not just adapted to giving away calories under pressure, it was adapted to giving them away while keeping itself functional, and the functioning required a body of knowledge that women themselves maintained and developed and refined across uncounted generations. This raises a question that will take us into the heart of the central revelation of this entire video, the question that all the previous chapters have been preparing us to ask. If the women were so knowledgeable, so adaptive, so collaborative with their own biology, so capable of intervening in their own physiology, with specific substances chosen for specific effects, then what exactly was the female body designed to do, at the deepest level, that no other arrangement of human biology could accomplish? What was the central biological function that 100,000 years of feeding others first was actually selecting for, when the selection pressure is examined not just at the level of the individual lifetime, but at the level of the species across deep time? The answer is in the next chapter, and the answer is larger than anything we have looked at yet. Chapter 7. What the female body is for. We have to begin this chapter with a piece of evidence that has been waiting at the edges of every previous chapter, never quite stated outright, because the moment has finally arrived to state it, and to state it completely. The evidence comes from a study published in 2018 by a team led by Holly Dunsworth of the University of Rhode Island, working in collaboration with anthropologists from Harvard University and the University of New Mexico and the City University of New York. The team set out to answer a question that had puzzled evolutionary biologists for decades, a question so basic that its difficulty had often been overlooked. Why do human females, alone among the great apes, experience menopause? Why do human women live decades past their reproductive years, when chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans do not? When female primates of nearly every species continue to reproduce until close to the end of their lives, or die shortly after their reproductive capacity ends? What was selection pressure doing during all those non-reproductive decades in human females? Why had evolution kept producing women who lived to 70 or 80 when their wombs had stopped working at 45 or 50? What was the female body for after it could no longer produce children? The answer that emerged from the Dunsworth team's analysis, combined with the long-running grandmother hypothesis work of Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, who had spent more than 3 decades developing and testing the idea with data from the Hadza and other populations, was this. The female body across human evolution was not selected only for reproduction, the way the female bodies of most mammals are. It was selected for sustained multi-generational food provision across an extended lifespan. The postmenopausal grandmother who could no longer reproduce was not biologically obsolete. She was, in fact, the keystone of the entire feeding economy on which human reproduction depended. She was the woman who had 30 or 40 more years of food processing capacity than any other adult in the band, who had accumulated the women's pharmacopoeia in her own memory across her decades of practice, who could feed her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren and her great-great-grandchildren, while her own daughters focused their reduced energy on nursing infants and bearing more children. She was the calorie engine. The data on this is remarkable, and it is worth describing in detail because it changes everything that follows. Hawkes and her colleagues, working with the Hadza of Tanzania across many years of careful field measurement, measured the actual caloric contribution of women of different ages across the entire reproductive lifespan and beyond, weighing every load of tubers and berries that came back to camp and tracking who had gathered what and who had eaten what. They found that women between 50 and 70 years old, well past menopause, were among the most productive food providers in the entire community. They walked further than younger women, sometimes farther than any other adult in the band. They dug more tubers per hour than younger women, because their technique was more efficient and their knowledge of which tubers were ready to dig was more accurate. They processed more food than younger women, because they were not interrupted by nursing infants or the demands of small children. They fed more people. The grandmother was not a dependent who relied on her relatives for her survival. She was the central calorie engine of the band, the single most productive provisioning unit in the entire community, capable of feeding multiple other adults and many children with the surplus from her daily work. This is the central revelation that this video has been building toward across 6 chapters and tens of thousands of years of evidence. The female body was not designed only to give calories to others during its reproductive years. It was designed to give calories to others across the entire human lifespan, from late childhood through the long postmenopausal decades, with reproduction occupying only a brief and biologically expensive window in the middle of that lifespan, and with the bulk of the female feeding capacity actually occurring before reproduction in girlhood and after reproduction in the long decades of postmenopausal life. The female body is a feeding machine first and a reproductive machine second. The reproductive function is a phase, an episode, a chapter, lasting perhaps 25 years out of a 70-year lifespan. The feeding function is the lifelong purpose, the constant from the moment a girl is old enough to grind to the moment an old woman lays down her grinding stone for the last time. This reframes everything we have looked at across the previous 6 chapters. The bones at Abu Hurera were not the bones of women whose reproductive systems were the central focus of their biology. They were the bones of women whose feeding systems were the central focus, and whose reproductive systems were a subset of that larger feeding function, a particular phase during which the feeding extended into the womb itself and the breast itself, rather than only outward into the village. The teeth at Pinnacle Point were not the teeth of mothers serving infants only. They were the teeth of provisioners serving multiple generations simultaneously. The dentalware that softened food for the infant was the same dentalware that softened food for the elder who had lost her own teeth. The same dentalware that softened food for the husband recovering from a hunting injury. The same dentalware that softened food for the orphaned cousin who had no other source of provisioned meals. The same dentalware that softened food for the visiting kin from another band, who arrived hungry and were fed before being asked any questions about why they had come. This is why menopause exists in the human female and not in our closest primate relatives, and this is the question that had puzzled evolutionary biologists for decades, and that the grandmother hypothesis finally answered. Menopause is the moment when the body reallocates its resources away from the metabolically costly process of reproduction and into the long phase of pure feeding work. It is not a decline. It is not a failure of the reproductive system. It is not a malfunction. It is a strategic shift, programmed by evolution as deliberately as puberty is programmed at the other end of the reproductive window. The postmenopausal woman is freed from the metabolic burden of monthly menstrual cycles, which have been drawing significant caloric and mineral resources from her body for decades. She is freed from the possibility of pregnancy, which had been an ever-present caloric threat throughout her reproductive years. She is freed from the constant draw of nursing infants on her own caloric supply. Her own body becomes more energy efficient. Her hunger system stabilizes further than it had been even during her reproductive years. Her sleep patterns shift to allow for earlier waking and later staying up, all of which optimize her capacity to feed others across a wider range of hours and a wider range of dependence. The evidence for this shift is biochemical, and it has been documented in dozens of studies of postmenopausal physiology conducted across the past several decades. The hormone estrogen, which drops sharply at menopause, and which is often discussed in modern medicine purely in terms of its loss, was costly to produce during the reproductive years and required substantial metabolic investment from the body's overall caloric budget. The drop in estrogen at menopause frees up that metabolic budget for other functions, including sustained moderate physical work and the cognitive demands of teaching and remembering and tracking the needs of an extended family. The hormone leptin, which we discussed at length in Chapter 4, recalibrates again at menopause to a slightly different set point, one that supports steady, moderate activity rather than the surges of energy required for childbearing and acute nursing. The body redistributes fat from the hips and thighs, where it was stored for reproductive support during the fertile years, to the abdominal region, where it provides a longer-term energy reserve more accessible during the daily work of provisioning and more easily mobilized for sustained moderate exertion. The bones, which had been protecting calcium reserves for fetal development across the reproductive years, release some of that protection, which is part of why postmenopausal women experience the bone density loss called osteoporosis. But even this loss is, in evolutionary terms, a reasonable trade. The grandmother who walks 5 miles a day to gather food for her grandchildren is more valuable to the survival of her genes than the grandmother who preserves perfect bone density but cannot work as long. The body chose mobility over density. The body chose work over preservation. The mathematics of grandmother investment has been worked out in detail by Hawkes and her colleagues and by independent research teams using mathematical models of population dynamics and genetic inheritance. They calculated that the additional grandchildren who survived to adulthood because of grandmother provisioning was, on average, between 1 and 3 per grandmother across the average postmenopausal lifespan. Across enough generations, this extra survival is enormous. It is in fact large enough by itself to explain why menopause and postmenopausal longevity evolved in the human species at all. despite the absence of similar adaptations in other primates. The grandmother was not just a nice addition to the family unit, a charming but optional figure. She was a major driver of human evolutionary success, possibly the single most important driver after upright walking and the enlarged brain. The brain itself, with its extended childhood development period, may have evolved as it did precisely because the grandmother was there to feed the slowly developing brains of her grandchildren during the long years when those brains were growing and learning and not yet capable of feeding themselves. The grandmother made the human brain possible. The grandmother made human childhood possible. The grandmother made the human species, in many of its distinguishing features, possible. This is why the adaptations we have been tracing across the first 6 chapters run as deep as they do. The female brain rewards food giving more strongly than food receiving, because the female brain, across the full human lifespan, spends most of its time giving rather than receiving. The female metabolism runs efficient on low caloric input because the female body, across the full human lifespan, is rarely fed first and is often fed last from a depleted pot. The female bones thicken in the locations of repetitive food processing because the female body, across the full lifespan, is repeatedly processing food in the same motions across decades. The female hormonal system protects the reproductive organs because during the brief reproductive window, that protection serves the larger feeding purpose by enabling the next generation of dependents to be born, and then, when reproduction ends, the hormonal system shifts gears and reallocates resources to extend the feeding function for another 30 or 40 years. The female body is, in this sense, the most remarkable feeding organism on Earth. No other mammal devotes such a large fraction of its biology, across such a long fraction of its lifespan, to the provisioning of others. No other primate has menopause followed by decades of food-providing work. No other species shows the universal pattern of female bones bent by grinding work across every settled population in human history. No other species shows the accumulated pharmacological knowledge that women carry across generations to support their own and others' bodies. The female body is unique among mammals, and the uniqueness is built around feeding, around provisioning, around the sustained multi-generational transfer of calories from the woman's hands to other people's mouths. And here is what this means for the women alive today, listening to this video right now. The female body in modern conditions, in a world of refrigerators and grocery stores and restaurants and food delivery apps and industrial agriculture and pharmaceutical supplements, is operating on hardware that was selected for a fundamentally different task than the task most modern lives present. The hardware still wants to feed others. The hardware still feels reward when it gives food away. The hardware still feels guilt or unease when it sits down to eat first, or to eat alone, or to eat without having prepared the food itself. The hardware still has hunger calibrated to a chronic mild deficit, rather than to chronic abundance. The hardware still has bones designed for the loads of processing and provisioning rather than the loads of sedentary office work. The hardware still has a postmenopausal phase optimized for sustained food work, ready for 30 more years of provisioning, waiting for the work that often does not come in modern conditions. When this hardware is asked to live in modern conditions, where the provisioning task has been largely externalized to grocery stores and restaurants and food companies, certain things happen, and they happen consistently enough that researchers in metabolism and endocrinology and geriatric medicine have begun to document the pattern. The reward systems that should have been activated by feeding others are activated instead by other forms of giving, sometimes in productive ways and sometimes in ways that produce their own forms of harm. The hunger system that was calibrated for chronic mild deficit struggles with chronic abundance, which is part of why women experience metabolic disorders differently than men in modern food environments, with different patterns of weight gain and different responses to dietary interventions and different outcomes when food restriction is imposed. The postmenopausal phase, which evolved to be the most productive feeding period of a woman's life, is treated in modern culture as a phase of decline, when biologically it is the opposite, the phase the entire female lifespan was actually designed to support, We will explore these consequences in the next chapter in more detail, because they are large enough to deserve their own treatment. For now, let the central revelation sit on the table where I have placed it. The female body across 100,000 years was not just changed by the work of feeding others. It was constructed for that work, from the bones outward, from the brain outward, from the hormones outward, from the gut outward, from the immune system outward. The work is what the female body is, and what it has been, for a span of time long enough that no other purpose has had the time to replace it, and no other shape has had the time to overwrite it. Chapter 8. What happens when the work stops? Now we turn to a question the previous chapters have made unavoidable. If the female body was constructed across 100,000 years for the work of feeding others, what happens to that body in the brief moment of modern history when the work in its ancient form has largely disappeared from many women's daily lives? The answer is, in evolutionary terms, only beginning to be visible, because the modern condition is so new that we are still in the first few generations of its effects. The first generation of women to live with refrigeration, with packaged food, with restaurants accessible to ordinary families, with food delivery, with industrial flour, with formula feeding, with the supermarket as the primary source of calories rather than the kitchen and the garden, is the generation born in the early 20th century. That is approximately 4 human generations. 4 generations against 4,000 generations of the ancestral pattern. The body has not had time to adjust. The body cannot, by any biological mechanism, adjust to a transformation of its environment that has occurred across a span shorter than 0.1% of its evolutionary history. What the body does instead is something that researchers in metabolism and endocrinology and public health are beginning to document, and the documentation is not pleasant to read. The first finding comes from a large meta-analysis published in 2019 by researchers at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, examining metabolic patterns in women across 12 industrialized nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and Sweden itself. The analysis pooled data from more than 400,000 women across multiple decades and found that women in modern food environments are experiencing a specific pattern of metabolic distress that does not match the pattern seen in men in the same environments, and that does not match the pattern seen in women in populations that retain traditional food provisioning roles. The female metabolic system, calibrated by evolution for chronic mild deficit, was responding to chronic abundance with a kind of physiological confusion. The hormones that should have signalled satiety were firing inappropriately, sometimes too strongly and sometimes too weakly. The hormones that should have signalled hunger were also firing inappropriately, often producing acute hunger spikes in the absence of any real caloric need. The insulin response was destabilizing across the menstrual cycle and across the perimenopausal transition. The fat storage system was distributing fat in patterns that did not match the patterns seen in foraging or early agricultural populations, and that produced different long-term health consequences than the ancestral pattern would have produced. The lead researcher on the Karolinska analysis, Erica Roman, put it bluntly in her published commentary in the journal Nature Medicine. The female body, she wrote, does not know what to do with a refrigerator. The system that evolved to handle chronic small inputs of plant-heavy food, while feeding others first and eating last, was now being asked to handle chronic large inputs of energy-dense food, while feeding herself first and feeding others through external systems like school cafeterias and grocery stores. The biological system was misfiring because the inputs no longer matched the design parameters by any reasonable approximation. The hardware was being run on the wrong operating system. The body was responding to that mismatch the way any complex system responds to operation outside its design parameters, with progressive small failures that accumulate over years and decades into recognizable disease patterns. The second finding is even more striking and in some ways more troubling than the first. A research team led by Susan Carnell at Johns Hopkins University, working across multiple studies in the 2010s with funding from the National Institutes of Health, examined the neurological correlates of food behaviour in modern women, particularly in the postmenopausal phase that the previous chapter identified as the phase the female lifespan was actually designed to support. They used functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at what was happening inside the brains of postmenopausal women as they engaged in different daily activities, and they compared the results to imaging of women in earlier life phases and to imaging of men of the same age. They found that postmenopausal women in industrialized societies showed a pattern of reduced neural reward response to all forms of activity, not just food-related activity. The brain regions that should have been firing during food provision, social caregiving, and sustained physical work were quiet, with much lower activation than the same regions showed in younger women, or in older women from populations that retained traditional provisioning roles. The women in the study reported feelings of purposelessness, mild depression, low-grade anxiety, and what the researchers called diffuse dissatisfaction, a feeling of life-lacking meaning that the women themselves often could not connect to any specific cause. The biological systems that had evolved to be most active and most rewarded in the postmenopausal phase were, in modern conditions, deprived of their evolved stimulus, and were responding with a kind of low-grade neurological grief that the women carried without understanding its origin. This finding has been replicated in multiple subsequent studies across multiple countries and populations. A team at University College London, led by Daisy Fancourt, found in a study published in 2021 that postmenopausal women who engaged in regular food-related provisioning activities, such as cooking meals for family members on a regular schedule, preparing food for community gatherings or religious communal meals, or growing and processing their own food in gardens or kitchens, showed significantly lower rates of depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline than postmenopausal women who did not engage in such activities, controlling for income, education, marital status, and physical health at baseline. The effect was robust across socio-economic levels, educational levels, and cultural backgrounds. Something about the specific act of preparing food for others was activating the neural systems that, in a forager or early farmer, would have been activated every day of the postmenopausal woman's life, and the activation appeared to protect those systems from the kind of slow deterioration that produces the modern epidemic of female depression and dementia in later life. This is the sixth revelation. The female body's adaptation to feeding others first did not just shape it positively when the work was present in daily life. It also shapes it negatively when the work is absent. The body experiences the absence of feeding work as a kind of biological deprivation, in much the same way that a body deprived of physical activity experiences muscle atrophy and bone loss, in much the same way that a brain deprived of social contact experiences cognitive decline. The feeding system, when unused, does not simply rest in a kind of biological neutral, it deteriorates. The neural reward circuits that should have been firing daily across the postmenopausal decades, when not fired, lose responsiveness and decay, in the same way that any unused circuit in the body eventually loses function. This deterioration appears in a specific cluster of modern health problems that affect women disproportionately, and that have become so familiar in modern medicine that they are often treated as normal aspects of female aging rather than as symptoms of a deeper mismatch. Osteoporosis, depression, anxiety disorders, certain autoimmune conditions, certain forms of cognitive decline including the higher rates of Alzheimer's disease in elderly women compared to elderly men, and certain forms of metabolic syndrome all appear more frequently in modern women than in women in populations that retain elements of traditional provisioning work. The correlation is not absolute, and many other factors contribute to these conditions, including genetics, lifelong habits, and the cumulative effects of stress and environment. But the pattern is clear enough that researchers including Roman, Carnell, Fancourt, and a growing number of others have begun to speak of an evolutionary mismatch, in which the female body's design parameters are not being met by modern conditions, and the body is responding with chronic low-grade illness that the medical system then treats as a series of unrelated specific diseases. This is not a story of nostalgia for a vanished past, and it is important to be clear about that before proceeding. The grinding stones at Abu Hurera destroyed the women who used them. The kneeling at Sayonu crippled the women who did it. The high-altitude grinding at Ñaupa Iglesia left women in chronic pain. Nobody is suggesting that women should return to grinding wheat by hand for 5 hours a day, or that the traditional provisioning life was good or healthy in some absolute sense. The point is more subtle and more important than nostalgia would allow. The female body evolved to do certain kinds of work across a certain pattern of daily life, and when that work is removed entirely with no functional replacement, the body suffers. The challenge of the modern condition, in this view, is not to recreate the ancient work in its original brutal form, but to find activities that activate the same biological systems in ways that are sustainable and healthy and compatible with modern conditions, in ways that give the body the stimulus it expects without paying the body the price the ancient work extracted. The seventh revelation begins to emerge here, and it carries the full weight of the previous 6 revelations stacked one on top of another. The female body in modern conditions is, in a profound biological sense, an unemployed organism. It was constructed for a job that no longer exists in its ancient form, and the alternatives offered by modern life often do not activate the same systems. The reward circuits are quiet, the metabolism is confused, the hormones are misfiring, the bones, deprived of the moderate sustained load they evolved to carry, are thinning prematurely in many modern women in ways that did not occur even in the malnourished women of the deep past, who often had denser bones at 60 than modern women have at 40. The brain, deprived of the multi-generational caregiving work it was wired to perform, is experiencing a kind of cognitive idleness that may be related to the higher rates of dementia in elderly women compared to elderly men, a sex difference that has resisted easy explanation in modern neuroscience, but that becomes more comprehensible in light of the evolutionary picture this video has been assembling. The mismatch is not a flaw in the female body. It is a feature of the female body operating in conditions for which it was not designed. The body did exactly what evolution selected for. It became efficient, durable, generous, calibrated, knowledgeable, and capable of sustaining itself and others across the long human lifespan. It is the world around the body that has changed in the last few generations, not the body itself. And the body is now waiting, often without knowing what it is waiting for the work it knows how to do. This is why the most consistent finding in modern longitudinal studies of female aging is that women who maintain active provisioning roles in their families and communities, who cook regularly for others rather than relying on prepared foods, who garden and process their own harvest, who care for children or grandchildren on a regular basis, who participate in food-related community work like meal programs or community gardens, who maintain the women's pharmacopoeia in whatever fragmentary modern form they have inherited it through family recipes and home remedies, age more slowly, retain cognitive function longer, sleep better, suffer less from depression and anxiety, and report higher life satisfaction than women who do not engage in any of these activities. The body, given any version of its ancient work in a form that is sustainable in modern conditions, responds by working well. The body, given no version of that work, responds by deteriorating across multiple systems simultaneously. The implications for contemporary medicine are substantial, and they are beginning to be recognized in a small but growing corner of geriatric research. The standard medical approach to women's aging has been to treat each symptom separately and pharmacologically. Osteoporosis with bisphosphonates and calcium supplements, depression with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, insomnia with sleep aids, cognitive decline with cognitive medications, and increasingly with the new disease-modifying treatments for Alzheimer's disease, metabolic syndrome with various combinations of drugs for blood pressure and blood sugar and cholesterol. The evolutionary view does not contradict these treatments, and the treatments themselves are often beneficial for the specific symptoms they address. but the evolutionary view adds a layer that conventional medicine has only recently begun to acknowledge. Many of these conditions cluster together in the same women because they share a common underlying cause, which is the deprivation of the evolved feeding and provisioning work that the female body expects across its lifespan. Treating each symptom without addressing the underlying mismatch is treating the smoke rather than the fire, and it is part of why the modern epidemic of chronic illness in older women has been so resistant to medical intervention, despite decades of pharmacological development. There are increasingly voices in medical research who are pointing in this direction. Geriatricians like Linda Fried at Columbia University have built entire research programs around the idea that purposeful activity, particularly purposeful activity that benefits others, is a foundational intervention for healthy aging in women, comparable in importance to nutrition and exercise, and possibly more important than either. The Experience Core program, which Fried developed and tested over 2 decades, places older women in roles where they care for and tutor younger children in under-resourced schools, providing real provisioning-style work in a modern setting. The outcomes for the older women in terms of physical health, cognitive function, depression rates, and emotional well-being have been consistently and significantly better than for control groups across multiple randomized trials, with effects large enough that the women receiving the intervention show improvements that no pharmaceutical intervention currently available can match. The work is, in evolutionary terms, a modern version of the grandmother's traditional role, repackaged for an urban industrial society, but activating the same ancient biological circuits. We come now to the final question this video must answer, before turning toward its conclusion. If the female body has been constructed across 100,000 years for a kind of work that the modern world has largely removed from many women's lives, what does this mean for the individual woman, today, in her own life, in her own body, sitting wherever she is sitting as she listens to this? The answer to that question is the substance of the next chapter, and it is intended specifically for the woman who is listening to this video right now, in her own home, with her own history, in her own body, with her own particular hands that have done their own particular versions of this work across the years of her own life. Chapter 9. What this means inside your body. I want to speak directly to you now, the woman listening. Across the last 7 chapters, I have laid down the evidence as carefully as I can, from named sites and named researchers, with measurements and dates and physical detail, with isotope ratios and dental wear patterns and brain imaging studies and skeletal compression data. The evidence is real. The pattern is real. The female body across 100,000 years has been shaped, in its bones and its brain and its chemistry, by the unbroken work of feeding others first, and that shaping is so deep and so extensive that it has become the basic shape of what the female body is. That history is not somewhere far away in a museum drawer or a journal article. It is inside you right now, in the body you're sitting in the hands resting in your lap or holding a cup of tea, in the spine supporting your shoulders, in the brain processing these words. It is the reason for certain things you have felt and certain things you have done, and certain things you have thought without ever quite having the language to explain them. It is why, when you cook a meal for your family, you taste from the spoon and then serve the others, and only then sit down with your own plate, often with a smaller portion than you put on everyone else's plates, and often with the less choice cuts of the meat or the smaller pieces of the bread. It is why you remember what each of your children prefers to eat, what each of your grandchildren refuses, what your husband or your mother or your friend used to love, even after years have passed and you have not cooked for them in a long time. It is why, when there is an extra piece of bread at the table, your hand does not reach for it without first checking that everyone else has had enough, and why even after checking your hand still hesitates and often retreats. It is why, when you're exhausted at the end of a long day, you do not want a large meal but something small and specific, something dense and restorative, the way the women at Pinnacle Point ate their shellfish at the end of a day of gathering. It is why you sleep lightly when there is a sick child in the house, and wake at the smallest sound from the next room. It is why your body, in the early morning hours, often wakes itself up before anyone else, ready to begin the day's provisioning, even though the modern day no longer requires you to walk 10 miles for tubers or kneel for hours at a grinding stone. The body is doing what the body knows, even when the conditions that made the knowing useful have changed beyond recognition. It is why, when your children leave home, you may have felt a particular kind of disorientation that the culture around you may not have named accurately. The culture calls it empty nest syndrome and treats it as a sentimental condition, a passing sadness that women experience because they have grown attached to their children and find it hard to let them go. But the biology beneath the empty nest experience is more concrete than sentiment, and the disorientation is more specific than ordinary grief. The neural systems that have been firing for decades in the work of feeding and tending and tracking the needs of others have suddenly lost their targets. The reward circuits that lit up at the family table are dimmer because the family table is smaller. The grocery list is shorter. The kitchen is quieter. The mental tracking system that kept records of what each child needed and preferred has fewer records to maintain. The body, which had been doing its evolved work across decades of motherhood, has effectively been laid off from a job it was designed to perform. The grief that many women feel in this transition is, in part, a biological grief, a response from the body to the absence of work for which the body was constructed. The work was real, and so is its absence. The culture's tendency to dismiss this grief as merely emotional or merely sentimental misses what the body itself is registering. It is why menopause, when it arrives, can feel like more than just a hormonal transition, and why the modern medical narrative about menopause often fails to capture what women actually experience. The standard medical narrative treats menopause as the end of a phase, the cessation of fertility, the decline of estrogen, a kind of biological retirement from the productive part of life. The evolutionary view treats it as the beginning of a different and equally important phase. Across 100,000 years, menopause was the doorway into the most productive feeding period of a woman's life, the period during which she became the central calorie engine of her extended family, the period during which the women's pharmacopoeia she'd accumulated across her years finally came into its full use, the period during which her hands and her mind had been preparing for since her own childhood. The hormonal changes you experience at menopause are not the body breaking down or running out of fuel. They are the body retooling for a different and larger phase of work. The hot flashes, the sleep disturbances, the redistribution of fat from hips and thighs to the abdomen, the changes in mood, the shifts in cognition, are all part of a coordinated reallocation of biological resources from one mode of operation to another. The body is making itself fit for 30 more years of work, often the most important 30 years it will ever do. It is the work itself that has gone missing in modern life, not the body's readiness for it. It is why the women in your family who lived the longest and stayed sharpest the latest were almost certainly the women who never stopped working. Not stopped working at a paid job, but stopped working at the daily provisioning of their families and communities. Think about them for a moment. The long-lived women in your own family line. The grandmother who cooked Sunday dinner for 15 people every week until she was 90, with the same recipes she had used since the 1940s. The table laid out with the same pattern of dishes in the same positions. The conversation flowing around her while she moved between the stove and the table and the sink. The aunt who kept the herb garden and the canning pantry and the family recipes written in a small notebook in her own hand, and who knew which jar of preserves to give to whom for which ailment, and who never seemed to be quite without a project in her kitchen even into her 80s. The neighbour who brought soup to every household with a sick child or a recent funeral, and who never showed up empty-handed at any gathering, and who, when the time came, was buried with the recipe for that soup written on a card pinned inside her dress by her granddaughter. These women, in the modern era, were doing the ancient work in modern conditions with whatever materials and people were available to them. Their bodies received the stimulus they had been designed for. Their brains received the rewards they had been wired to receive. Their bones, loaded with the regular moderate work of cooking and carrying and tending and walking to the garden and back, stayed denser than the bones of their less active peers. Their minds, exercised daily by the complex tracking of multiple people's preferences and schedules and needs, stayed sharper longer than the minds of women who sat quietly in rooms with nothing to track. It is why the loneliness that older women report in modern surveys is often not just social loneliness, but a more specific kind of deprivation, a deprivation that social contact alone does not relieve. The Hadza grandmother is not lonely in the way a modern American grandmother can be, even when the Hadza grandmother is technically alone for hours of the day, on a tuba digging expedition far from camp, because the Hadza grandmother is at work, doing the work her body knows. She is digging tubas, she is processing food, she is feeding her grandchildren by gathering for them, and the gathering is its own form of company, its own form of meaning, its own form of biological satisfaction. The modern grandmother, who may live alone in an apartment with a refrigerator full of food she does not need to process, and a kitchen she may rarely use, is experiencing a kind of loneliness that has a biological component that ordinary social interventions cannot fully address. Her body is asking for the work, and the work is not coming, and the absence of work creates a particular kind of biological emptiness that even rich social contact does not fill, because the company of others without the work of feeding them does not activate the circuits the body was designed around. It is why the women in modern surveys who report the highest life satisfaction in their later years are almost universally women who have found ways to feed others in some form. Not necessarily their own immediate family members, because many modern families are scattered geographically, and the daily provisioning of relatives is no longer possible for many women. Sometimes a community garden where the harvest is distributed to neighbours, sometimes a meal program at a community centre where she helps prepare food twice a week. Sometimes a regular cooking date with friends, a Sunday breakfast tradition, a weekly soup-making routine with a group of similar women. Sometimes a kitchen table tradition of teaching grandchildren how to make bread or jam or pasta, or whatever the family tradition has carried forward. Sometimes the woman who runs the church food pantry, or the one who organises the funeral meals, or the one who shows up at every neighbour's house with something in a covered dish during any time of difficulty. The biological system does not require that the others being fed be one's own descendants by blood. It only requires that the feeding be happening, that the body be doing the work it was designed to do, that the rewards be activating, that the hunger be calibrated against the giving, that the hands be moving in their evolved motions. It is why, perhaps most importantly, the way you feel about your own body may be deeply distorted by a culture that does not understand what the female body is for at any point in its lifespan. The culture has told you, in countless explicit and implicit messages across your entire life, that your body's value lies primarily in its reproductive years, that menopause is a decline, that aging is loss, that an older woman is a less valuable woman than a younger one, that the body's worth peaks somewhere between 20 and 35 and declines from there. The evolutionary evidence says the opposite, point for point in every particular. Your body's reproductive years were a relatively brief and biologically expensive phase, undertaken in service of the larger feeding purpose. Your postmenopausal years are not a decline. They are the body's longest and most productive feeding phase, the phase for which menopause was actually evolved as a strategic shift rather than as a failure. The body you have at 60 or 70 or 80 is not a faded version of the body you had at 30. It is, in evolutionary terms, the version of the body that the species was actually selecting for across the long centuries, the version that the entire reproductive system existed to make possible. The young reproductive body was the means, the older feeding body is the end. The culture has the value structure exactly backward, and the body, when listened to honestly, says so. I want to ask you one more thing, and this is the most personal question of the video. When you think about the women in your family who came before you, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, the women whose photographs you may have on your wall, the women whose recipes you may still cook, the women whose voices you can still hear in your memory when you stand in your own kitchen, does something now make sense to you about how they lived? About how they ate last at every meal you remember sharing with them? About how they remembered everyone's preferences without seeming to try? about how they kept feeding people long after they could have stopped, well into ages when their hands shook and their feet hurt, about how they seemed, even at the end of their lives, to know exactly what to do in a kitchen, and exactly what to do with a sick child, and exactly what to do when grief came through the door of a neighbour or a friend or their own family. Tell me in the comments what you remember about those women, because what you remember is the women's pharmacopoeia, passed down to you in fragments, the trace of 100,000 years of evolved knowledge moving forward through your family one generation at a time, from mother to daughter and grandmother to granddaughter, until it reached you and stopped there, in your memory, in your hands, in the recipes you still make and the gestures you still perform without thinking about where they came from. The body you're sitting inside as you listen to this is the same body. It carries the same equipment as the body that carried your great-grandmother through her long years of provisioning. The hardware has not been replaced or upgraded or modified in any meaningful way across the 4 generations between her and you. It is operating in different conditions, yes, with different challenges and different deprivations and different abundances and different daily demands. But the equipment itself is what your grandmother's was, and what her grandmother's was, and what the woman at Abu Hurera's was 11,000 years ago, kneeling on her stone, grinding her grain, feeding her village. You are in the line. The line did not stop at any earlier generation. The line did not stop at the modern era. The line is still running through you, and your body is the current end of it, the most recent expression of a continuous biological inheritance that goes back across thousands of generations to a time before our species had a name. What you do with that body and the conditions you have is the next chapter of the story, and there is no script written for it in advance. The ancient work is not coming back in its original brutal form, and it should not. Nobody is going to kneel for 5 hours a day grinding wild quinoa at 14,000 feet, and nobody should. But the body is asking for some version of its work, some modern translation of the ancient pattern, some activity that activates the circuits the body was built around. And the body is also asking for some recognition of what it has been across the long centuries before this one. That recognition is, in some real sense, what this video has been trying to give across the past 2 hours. The recognition is overdue by approximately 100,000 years. The female body has been doing this work without acknowledgement for a very long time. In the final chapter, I want to bring forward one piece of evidence I've held back specifically for this moment, because it answers a question I suspect you've been holding without quite knowing how to ask it. The question is whether any society has ever recognized, while it was happening, while the women were still alive to receive the recognition, what the female body was doing across the long centuries of feeding work. The answer, surprisingly, is yes. At least one society did, and the evidence of that recognition was buried with the women in a gravesite in the Iberian Peninsula, where the next chapter takes us for our final piece of evidence. Chapter 10. The Grave at Atapuerca. This site is the cave complex of Atapuerca in the hills of northern Spain, about 10 miles east of the city of Burgos, in a landscape of limestone outcrops and oak forests that has remained relatively unchanged for thousands of years. Atapuerca is one of the most important archaeological sites in Europe, occupied by various human and pre-human populations for nearly 1 million years, with stratigraphic layers that record the entire span of human presence on the European continent. The site has been excavated continuously since the 1970s by teams led initially by Emiliano Aguirre and more recently by Juan Luis Arzuaga, José María Bermúdez de Castro, and Eudald Carbonell, 3 of the most respected paleoanthropologists in Europe. Within Atapuerca there are multiple specific sites of different ages, including a pit called Cima de los Huesos that contains the remains of at least 28 pre-modern humans from roughly 400,000 years ago, and that has produced more pre-modern human bones than any other single site on Earth, and a more recent burial complex called El Mirador that dates to between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago, near the end of the Neolithic period in Iberia and the beginning of the Copper Age. The evidence I've held back for this final chapter comes from El Mirador, and it was published in a series of papers by Maria Eulalia Subirà and her colleagues at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, beginning in 2014 and continuing across the next several years with additional analyses and reinterpretations as more material became available. The team had been analysing the burial patterns and the grave goods of the El Mirador population, looking for patterns that might illuminate the social structure of late Neolithic Iberia, and they noticed something that did not appear at other Neolithic sites in the region, and that, once recognised, transformed the interpretation of the El Mirador community. At El Mirador, the female burials of older women estimated to have been in their 50s and 60s at death based on dental wear patterns and skeletal degeneration, contained a specific set of grave goods that did not appear in any other burial category at the site. The grave goods included grinding stones, the personal portable kind similar to those at Ñaupa Iglesia, polished smooth from years of use and clearly the woman's own working tool. They included small ceramic vessels containing residues of milk and lactation, supporting herbs of the kind already documented at Sayonu, vessels that the woman had presumably used during her own reproductive years to support her own nursing of her own children, and that had been kept by her into old age. They included polished bone needles for sewing, suggesting that the woman had also been a maker of clothing for her family. They included collections of dried medicinal plants, suggesting her continued role as a keeper of the pharmacopoeia. And they included one item that had never been documented before in a Neolithic Iberian context, and that became the most discussed aspect of the El Mirador findings. The item was a small carved stone figurine, no larger than a thumb, depicting a seated woman with her arms held out in front of her, palms up, in a posture that the Subirà team interpreted, after considering many alternative interpretations, as a gesture of offering. The figurines were found in 7 separate older female burials across the El Mirador complex. In each case, the figurine was placed near the right hand of the deceased, the working hand, the hand that had ground and stirred and sewn and held children and tended fires across a long lifetime. The carving was consistent enough across the 7 examples that the team concluded the figurines had been made by the same maker or the same workshop and distributed deliberately to specific women at the time of burial. The figurines were not found in male burials. They were not found in young female burials, even when the young women had died from complications of childbirth and had been buried with other grave goods. They appeared only in the graves of women old enough to have completed the reproductive phase and entered the long provisioning phase that the previous chapters of this video have established as the central biological purpose of the female lifespan. The Subirà team's interpretation, presented carefully and tentatively in their published papers, because no archaeologist wants to overinterpret a small finding from a single site, was that the figurines mark something specific about these women. They marked their role as provisioners across the full span of their lives. The seated woman with arms outstretched in offering was a recognition, a memorial, a statement that the woman in the grave had spent her life feeding others, and the community knew it, and the community wanted her to be remembered for it. The grinding stones in the grave were not abstract goods placed there for symbolic reasons. They were the specific tools she had used across her decades of work, the same tools that had pressed against her hands and worn the same grooves into her bones that all the women in this video had worn into their bones. The vessels with milk residues were not random items. They were the tools she'd used during her years of nursing and her later years of helping her daughters and granddaughters with their nursing. The figurine was the community's mark of acknowledgement placed deliberately beside her hand. "We see what you did," the figurine said. "We remember. We are placing this object here so that you will know, in whatever comes after, that we knew." This was not religion in any modern sense, and the Subirà team was careful to make this clear in their published interpretations. We have no evidence that the figurines were objects of worship, or that they represented any deity or spiritual figure. We have no evidence of ritual practice associated with them beyond their placement in the graves. What we have is evidence of a community that, 4,500 years ago, in the hills of northern Spain, in the final phase of the Neolithic period, looked at the older women who had spent their lives feeding everyone else, and chose to mark their lives with a specific physical object placed in their graves at the moment of burial. The mark was made. The body in the grave was acknowledged. The work was named in physical form for the first time we can document in the entire archaeological record. This finding is, in some ways, the most moving piece of evidence in this entire video, and it is the reason I have held it back until the end. Across 100,000 years, the female body had been doing this work without record, without acknowledgement, without a name attached to the labour. The bones at Abu Hurera had no figurines beside them. The teeth at Pinnacle Point had no figurines. The hip pouches at Ñaupa Iglesia had medicines but no figurines. The vessels at Sayonu had residues but no figurines. The cumulative work of countless women across countless generations had gone, by and large, unmarked by the communities they had served, recognised only by their daughters and granddaughters in the small acts of memory that families have always preserved but that do not survive into the archaeological record except in fragments. And then, in this one place, at this one time, in late Neolithic Iberia, a community decided to mark it. 7 women received the figurine. 7 women were buried with a physical object that said, "This is what she did, and we know it, and we are sending her into the next world with the knowledge that her work was seen." We do not know who made the decision to begin marking the graves this way, or whether the practice spread within El Mirador across only a few generations or persisted longer. We do not know what the makers of the figurines called themselves, or what they called the figurines. We do not know if the practice spread to other communities in late Neolithic Iberia, or died out with the people of El Mirador in some climate shift or disease outbreak. We know only that for a brief window in late Neolithic Iberia, a society recognised what the female body had been doing across the long centuries, and it made a small physical object to say so, and the object survived in the ground for 4,500 years until it was lifted by Subara's team and brought into the laboratory and described in a paper and made available to the rest of us. The Atapuerca finding does something the previous chapters could not quite do on their own. It closes the loop. It confirms that the work we have been documenting across this video was not invisible to the people who lived in the world where the work was being done. The men and the children and the elders of these communities saw it. They knew. They knew which women had done the most work and lived the longest doing it. They knew who had ground the grain and processed the milk and gathered the herbs and softened the food for the toothless, and fed the children of relatives who could not feed their own, and taught the daughters and the granddaughters how to do all of it. They knew which grandmothers had walked the most miles, raised the most grandchildren, kept the longest memories, and held the most knowledge in their hands. And in at least one community at one moment in human history, they made an object that said so, and placed it in the graves of the specific women whose work it acknowledged. That object, the small carved figurine of the seated woman with her arms held out in offering, is now in the museum at the University of Burgos, where it can be visited by anyone who travels to that city. You can see it in photographs in the published papers by Subira and her colleagues, reproduced in the journals where they appeared. It is not a beautiful object by modern standards of fine art, and it would not catch the eye of a casual museum visitor looking at the Neolithic collections. It is rough. It is small. It is unsophisticated next to the great art of later eras, the elegant figurines of classical Greece or the dynamic sculptures of Renaissance Italy. But it is the only one of its kind in the archaeological record, the only physical object known to have been carved specifically to acknowledge what the female body across the long centuries had been doing, the only marker we possess that says, before all the marble busts of generals and kings and philosophers were ever conceived, somebody noticed the women who fed everyone and made an object to say their names had been worth remembering, even if those names themselves have not survived. I find myself at the end of this video thinking about that figurine and the 7 women in whose graves it was placed. I think about the woman who made the first one, somewhere in the hills of northern Spain, 4,500 years ago, working with simple stone tools on a piece of soft local stone, and what she might have been thinking as she carved. I think about whether she carved it for her mother, or for her grandmother, or for the older woman in her family who had taught her how to grind grain on the same kind of stone the figurine itself would later be buried beside. I think about whether she knew, as she worked the stone slowly with her hands, that she was making something that would survive long after her body and the bodies of the women she remembered had returned to the earth, and that it would be found by people in a different age who would understand what it meant and who would be moved by it across the immense distance of 45 centuries. The figurine was meant for the women it acknowledged, for the dead who were carrying it forward into whatever came after death, but it has reached us through the soil of Atapuerca and the patience of the excavators and the careful work of the Subara team and the publication of the findings in journals and books, and it has reached you now, listening to this video at the end of a long evening. It is, in a way, the gift that the older women of El Mirador sent forward across the millennia, the one piece of recognition that travelled across 4,500 years and arrived in front of you, the woman listening, the most recent end of the long line. You are receiving it now. The line, which has been carrying this work from Abu Hurera forward through every settled community since, has also been carrying this acknowledgement forward, even if the acknowledgement has been small and rare and easily missed in the vast archaeological record of more visible things. The female body across 100,000 years has been the central feeding organism of the human species, and the body knows it, and the bones know it, and the brain knows it, and the chemistry knows it. The body has been waiting, in some real sense, for the recognition that the figurine at El Mirador began to provide 4,500 years ago, and that has only rarely been provided since in any explicit form. The body that is reading this now, listening to this now, sitting wherever you are sitting as the video draws to a close, is the inheritor of all of that long history. The work, the knowledge, the bones, the rewards, the costs, the strength, the longevity, the postmenopausal capacity, the women's pharmacopoeia, the maternal memory, the provisioning instinct, the hand that hesitates over the last piece of bread, the eye that scans the table to make sure everyone has been served. All of it is yours, inherited, present, alive in the body you are sitting in tonight. The figurine is yours now too. The acknowledgement that the El Mirador community sent forward 4,500 years ago has reached you, the woman listening, and it has reached you with all the weight of the long centuries behind it. Conclusion. When the lights are low and the day is finished and you're sitting somewhere with your own thoughts, perhaps with a cup of something warm in your hands, perhaps with the house quiet around you, I would like you to consider what it means to be the current end of a line 100,000 years long. Every woman in that line woke up before dawn, or before whatever passed for dawn in her latitude and her season. Every woman in that line fed somebody else first, in some form or another, with whatever food was available to her hands. Every woman in that line knew, in her own way, what her body could do and what it was for, even when she could not have said it in words, even when the culture she lived in did not provide her with the language to say it. Most of them did not have the language we now have to describe what was happening inside them. They had only the body itself, the hands they used, the children they fed, the work they finished or did not finish before night came back around and another day began. You have something they did not have. You have the language. You have the names of the sites and the researchers and the dates. You have the dental wear patterns and the cortical bone measurements and the isotope ratios and the neural reward circuits. You have the figurine at El Mirador and the bones at Abu Hurera and the teeth at Pinnacle Point and the grinding stones in the hip pouches at Ñaupa Iglesia. You have the long view, looking backward across 4,000 generations, that none of those women could have had while they were inside their own lives, while they were still busy with the daily work that filled every hour they were awake. This is the gift the evidence makes possible. It does not change what your body is, or what your body has been across the long centuries that produced it. It only changes what you, the conscious mind sitting inside that body tonight, can understand about it. The body has always known. The The body has been doing this work without complaint and without praise and without explanation, since long before there were words for any of it. What the evidence offers is a way for the mind to finally see what the body has been doing and to name it, properly, with the weight of all the centuries behind the naming. The female body is not a smaller version of the male body, and it never was. It is not a weaker version. It is not a version that peaks in its 20s and declines from there. It is its own organism, with its own evolutionary history, its own design parameters, its own long arc from girlhood through the reproductive years and into the long productive decades of the postmenopausal phase. The arc is whole. No part of it is decline. The bones that ache at 60 are not failing. They are the bones of a feeder who has been working for half a century, and the work has marked them, and the marking is honourable rather than shameful. The body that has carried you to this evening, this moment, this video, is the body that the species was actually building across the long span of its evolution. It is the body the line was leading toward. What I hope you take from this video is not a feeling of sadness about what was done to women across the long past. The women who lived inside that long past did not, by and large, feel sad about their lives in the way that modern interpretations sometimes project onto them. They were tired, often, with the specific tiredness of bodies that had worked all day. They were hungry, often, with the specific hunger their bodies had been calibrated to carry. They were grieving, often, for the children who did not survive, and the parents who died too young, and the friends who were lost to the dangers of their world. But they were also, by every account we have from ethnographic and historical sources, deeply embedded in lives of purpose, lives in which their bodies were doing exactly what their bodies were for, lives in which the work they did was visible to them and to the people they fed, and was rewarded by both biological and social systems that made the work feel right. The sadness, if there is sadness in this story, is the modern sadness of a body that knows its purpose and cannot find the work, the sadness of an organism designed for an environment that no longer exists in its original form. That is a sadness we can address. We can find some version of the work. We can make the meal. We can teach the grandchild. We can keep the herb garden. We can hold the family memory. We can pass the recipe forward. The body knows what to do when it is given any version of its evolved task to perform, and the body in front of you, the body inside which you are sitting now, the body that has carried you to this evening, and this video, and this moment of reflection, is the same body that walked out of the South African caves with shellfish in its hands 90,000 years ago. The same body that knelt at the grinding stones at Abu Hurera 11,000 years ago. The same body that climbed the Andes to dig wild quinoa 8,000 years ago. The same body that was buried with a small carved figurine in the hills of northern Spain 4,500 years ago. It is one continuous body, passed down through your mothers and your grandmothers and your great-grandmothers, and you are its current expression in the world tonight. You are how it shows up at this moment in history. You are how the long line reaches into the present. I would like to know, before we end, what you're thinking now about the body you're inside. Not about the female body in some general or abstract sense, but about your specific body, the one with your specific history and your specific habits and your specific hands that have done their specific versions of this work across the specific years of your specific life. Has something shifted in how you understand it after listening to all of this? Is there something it does that now has a context it did not have an hour ago? Is there an act you perform without thinking that now seems less small than it did before, less invisible, less unworthy of notice? Tell me in the comments. The next video in this series will be shaped by what you say, by what you remember, by what your own body has told you tonight. Thank you for staying with me through this long evening. There is more to come.